as if this were regular JavaScript isn't really going to work. If I do this, I'm going to get the literal text of first name plus last name interpreted as the text content of my H1. Fortunately, React has made it really simple to interpret something as JavaScript instead of text when it's inside of a JSX element. And that is by simply surrounding it with a single set of curly braces, almost like it were an object. So at this point, before I even hit save, I'm going to give you a quick challenge. Simply enough, I want you to finish off the H1 that we have here so that it says, "Hello, Joe Schmo." And actually, let's put an exclamation point in there for good measure. Pause the screencast and do this challenge. Well, if I hit save, we'll see that it interprets the Joe correctly. Instead of saying first name, it's now taking the value of our first name JavaScript variable and inserting it here. And then, of course, the rest of this text is still there. If I were just to surround last name, then I would get a little bit closer, but I still have my plus and my quotation marks. So at this point, I can just get rid of those, put a space in between my two values, hit save, and there we go. Hello, Joe Schmo. The way I like to think of this is that as soon as I start seeing JSX, the interpreter sort of goes into JSX mode. Anything after this greater than symbol is going to start being considered the text content, or in the case of having nested elements, other JSX elements. And we're currently in what you could call JSX land. However, as soon as we see this opening curly brace, we switch back into our JavaScript mode or JavaScript land. And then anything inside of my set of curly braces will be considered JavaScript. Once I get to this closing curly brace, I'm now back into JSX, which is why I have an actual space in the text between my first name and my last name. Then it sees my curly brace again, so I'm back in JavaScript land. The closing curly brace tells me I'm done with JavaScript. I get the exclamation point as part of my actual text. And then I close off my JSX tag. Now, once I enter JavaScript land, I can actually do more than just take in values from my JavaScript up above. In fact, anything that I put inside of my curly braces can be run as JavaScript code. Let me clean up this challenge really quick. Something that's important to note is that anything I put inside of my curly braces will be run as regular JavaScript code. So I'm not limited to just pulling in values like this. For example, I could do something like, say, I have a new date, which is a new date object, and then change this to something like it is currently about, and then run some JavaScript code inside of my curly braces, saying date.getHours. And then let's say we want to do a modulo 12 so that we get the AM PM hours, or rather like on a 12-hour clock. I hit save, and there we go. It's currently about 3. Maybe I say o'clock. And that's because for me, when I'm recording this, it's currently 3:21 p.m. And in fact, I wouldn't even necessarily need to create my date outside of here. I could say new date dot get hours, and I'm going to get the same result, even without doing it out here, because anything that I put inside these curly braces will be run as regular JavaScript. Now, personally, I think it's a lot more readable to do the actual JavaScript outside of my return value in my JSX. So if I were doing this in the real world, I'd probably say something like const hours equals date dot get hours modulo 12, and then inside of my render down here, all I'm doing is putting hours. And of course, we get the same result that way. One thing that's nice about doing it this way is you can sort of separate the logic that your component is running with the display that your component needs to show on the screen. So for example, let's say I wanted to say, depending on the time of day, good morning, good afternoon, or good night. Well, I could do all of my logic up here to determine what should display after the word good. For example, I want it to say good afternoon because for me right now it's afternoon. I could do something like this, and I'll probably speed this up so it doesn't take up too much time. All I've done really is created a changeable variable, let time of day, and then said if the current hours is less than 12, it's morning. If it's between 12 and 17, then it's afternoon, and otherwise it's considered night. I probably should make something for evening because 5 o'clock p.m. seems a little bit early to say goodnight to someone, but whatever. So here's another mini challenge for you. Okay, your challenge is simply to fix the H1 below to use the time of day string that we determined in the code above. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Simply enough, all we really need to do is remove the hard-coded afternoon, put a set of curly braces, and then say time of day. Now, of course, because it is afternoon for me, this will still say afternoon. I suppose I could just trick this. Maybe I change this to say if it's between 12 and 1, then we consider it afternoon, but otherwise it's good night. I should be able to hit refresh, and sure enough, it says good night. I'm going to change that back so that's not so weird. Okay, with that concept, we are primed to now jump back into props and to see what the syntax of props actually looks like. To help guide us through learning the syntax of using props in React, we're going to look at this little contact book that I created here. As you can see in our app component, everything is hard-coded. Each one of these divs, which I separated with a little space in between each one, represents one of the contact cards. But of course, all of the data is hard-coded inside, which means if I ever needed to make a change, especially to something like the styling, I'm going to have to make that change to every instance of this contact card that we see here. Before we can really talk about props though, we have a challenge for you, and that challenge is to create a separate component called contact, which as the challenge shows will be in a different file. And then I just want you to choose one of the contacts that we have here to move into that file. Essentially, you can just copy and paste one of these contacts over into your contact component. Then, once you've moved one of these contacts over to the contact component, I want you to import the contact component and render 4 instances of it here inside our app component. While you're working on that part of the challenge, I want you to think ahead what's going to be the problem with doing it this way. Okay, pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, so I'll create a new file called contact.js. And in contact.js, we'll import React from React. We'll export default, our function contact. And for now, we're just going to copy and paste one of the contacts. Let's choose Mr. Whiskerson here. Okay, that should have been easy enough. Inside of app, we will then import contact from our contact file. And then instead of completely deleting all of these, because I think I want access to this data, I'm going to actually move them down outside of my component and then just comment them out. That way I still have access to them, but they're out of the way. And now I'm going to render 4 instances of my contact component. If you didn't make it this far, or you didn't take the chance to think ahead what's going to be wrong with doing it this way, I want you to think now, what's going to be wrong when I create 4 instances of this contact component? Well, if I hit save, we get 4 Mr. Whiskersons. And as much as we love Mr. Whiskerson, we still need the data from our other contacts here in our contact book. Why exactly is this happening? Well, when we copied one of the contacts and pasted it over, we pasted the data with it. Just like a function, let's say add 2 numbers, that takes no parameters and simply returns a hard-coded amount, in this case 1 plus 2, every time we call this function, it will always give us the same result. In the same way, our contact card has that data embedded inside of it, or hard-coded in it, and therefore it's going to show up every time we make an instance of that component. Now, similar to how we instead will usually pass some parameters to a function, which make it more flexible and reusable, I can say return a plus b, and now suddenly I have an infinite number of possibilities with this function because all I need to do when I'm calling it is pass in the real values that I want this function to use. We can do essentially the exact same thing in React. The remainder of this screencast is going to be focused on how we pass data into our contact component. And in the next screencast, we're going to look at how we can consume that data from our contact component so that we get back to a working state where we have 4 different contacts in our contact book. Let me delete this function. We'll go back to app.js and focus here on our instances of the contact component. Just like we talked about how HTML allows us to pass attributes which can alter the behavior of the element, React chose to do things in a very similar way. However, in HTML, where we are limited to using only the attributes that are allowed for any given element, for example, I couldn't pass a whatever I want attribute to a link tag because that's not defined in the HTML spec. With React, because this is a custom component, I can pass in any property or attribute that I want. We have 4 pieces of data in each one of our contact cards that we need to pass down to our instances of the contact component. So to do that, I can add an image prop, or let's call it IMG. This image prop can be the value of the path to the image. So I'll go ahead and copy that from Mr. Whiskerson here. Again, in the next lesson, we'll be learning how to actually consume these properties that we're passing in. But for now, we're just going to be dedicated to adding these properties to the contact component on our instances. Now, the upcoming challenge might be something that you decide you really hate me for giving to you. I'm going to do one more of these props, and then I will update our challenge to give you a chance to practice typing out your own props to each one of these contact cards. I'm going to put this on its own line because I already know I'm going to be adding a bunch of these. The next piece of data that I'll need in each one of my components is a name. So let's choose to call it name. I'll come down here and just copy Mr. Whiskerson's name and pass it in. And this is the point at which I'll update this challenge for you. Okay, once again, I promise I'm not doing this to be mean, but I do want you to do a little bit of busy work, mostly just to get your hands on the keyboard and start practicing what it's like to add your own props to this contact component. Remember, we get to decide what we call these props. We could call this whatever we want, but of course that's going to be more confusing, so I'll stick with name. The other 2 pieces of data we still need to pass down are the phone number and the email. So finish up the first contact first by adding a phone and email prop, and then I want you to fill out all the data for the remaining 3 contacts with the image, name, phone, and email props. All of the data, of course, can still be found here, so you'll have a bit of copying and pasting to do. Pause the screencast and add the rest of our props to our contacts. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too painful for you, and hopefully you got a good sense of what it's like to add props to React components. I'll finish up this first contact together, and then I'll probably skip over the rest. So let's add a phone prop here. I can just come down and copy Mr. Whiskerson's phone number, and we'll add an email prop as well, and we'll copy this as well. Now, I'm going to go ahead and finish up these contacts, but I'll skip over that so you don't have to watch me monotonously copying and pasting the data from below. Okay, that wasn't so bad, was it? At this point, I can come down and get rid of this old version that we have here, just to clean things up a little bit. I'll also clean up our challenge. And at this point, you probably can see that things are a lot more organized. Sure, we still have a good number of lines of code here, but the data is the primary focus. We can see exactly what data we're passing into our contact component, and then our contact component contains the specific display logic on how the data should be used. Of course, at this point, we haven't made any changes to the contact component. So if I hit refresh, what do you think will happen? Well, hitting refresh won't change anything. We're still going to have 4 instances of Mr. Whiskerson, because essentially what we have now is a function like our add to numbers that takes parameters A and B, but still is returning hard-coded data. So even if we call add to numbers, or let's say, let's call this numbers, and we pass in 5 and 10, it doesn't really matter at this point that we're passing in 5 and 10 because the body of the function is still returning hard-coded numbers. So in the next screencast, let's see how we can make use of the properties that will be passed into this component so we can get back to a place where we have our 4 different instances of our contact card. In the last lesson, we learned about how to pass values into our components using a very similar syntax that we're already used to with attributes in HTML. In React, we don't call these attributes, we actually call them properties, or usually for short, just props. Unfortunately, it's very easy to get the data that we're passing into our components inside of our component itself. Right here, just like a function that takes parameters, I'm going to put the word props. In truth, I could call this whatever I want. In fact, I'll show you exactly what happens. I'm going to console log what we called whatever. And let me make a little room here, open the console, and hit save. Now, 4 things got logged to the console. I want you to think for a second, why did it console log 4 times? It console logged 4 times because I have 4 contact instances. Every time React rendered one of my contacts, it ran the console log line inside of the code of that component. And if you look closely, you'll see that we have 4 properties in that console. Let me copy one of them out here so I can actually reference it. We got 4 properties here. If I clean these up each onto their own line, you can see that what we received, what we're calling whatever, is an object that has properties that match exactly with what we put here as our prop inside of the component here. Let's see what happens if I maybe change img to something like the whole word of image. Again, I can change these to whatever I want them to be. So now when I hit save, if you look down below, the first item is receiving an object that now has an image property all spelled out, whereas all the other ones are still receiving an img property. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much, so let's come up here and change whatever to props, because props is what you'll usually be calling this. And at this point, I want you to pause the screencast and see if you can figure out how to use this object that has all of the properties we want to update our component. This one's going to take some critical thinking, but I want you to really think through it, see if you can figure out how to essentially make it so that our components are not 4 instances of Mr. Whiskerson, but rather have the correct data and images displaying here. Let me type that out as a real challenge. Okay, there's your challenge. Pause the screencast and see if you can make it so that essentially we finish this little contact book where each one is its own separate contact. Pause now and work on this challenge. Well, if props is an object and I can access the values of that object by using props dot, for example, name, props dot image, then all I really should have to do is update this hard-coded data, for example, the name here, to curly braces props dot name. Of course, if I didn't put the curly braces in there, it would literally interpret the text props dot name, and then all of the names would say props dot name. When I surround it with curly braces, awesome, my names are changing. Obviously, nothing else has changed. So let's go ahead and do the rest. I'll start with these easy ones. We'll get props.phone and props.email. Okay, the phone and email are coming through correctly. Now the image. This one may have been a little bit trickier for you, but simply all I'd have to do is erase the entire source, including the quotation marks, and put my JavaScript here. Because the value that's coming in through props.image, or img, is already a string, it's going to fill in the string value for my source. I hit save, and there's all of my values. But here's a bug. I introduced this when I was teaching the concept. Hopefully this was a good chance for you to do some debugging. If you didn't, I want you to see if you can figure out why the picture for Mr. Whiskerson is not coming in. Pause the screencast and try to fix this bug. Well, right here for our image source, we're assuming that we're receiving a prop called img. Back in app.js, however, I did change this to image. So I'll change this back to img. Hit save, and now the photo for Mr. Whiskerson is coming in just fine. Now, I hope I'm not belaboring the point. Understanding props is one of the most crucial things that you can do in React when you're learning. So yes, we've spent a lot of time covering props. However, you will use props every single day of your React life. So this is a really big milestone. If you feel like you've understood everything in React that we've talked about so far, you should really congratulate yourself, pat yourself on the back, and probably at this point, take a little break. Don't try to bite off too much more than you can chew. And I do want to show you a little cool trick that we can do with our props here in the next screencast. Okay, it's time to give you a prop quiz. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Like before, your task is to read through each of these questions, to actually click into the editor and type down your answers. Don't forget, in Scrimba, if you have any changes that you make to the code, you can always save it as a note so that you have access to it later. You can even record your own voice talking over the top of the note if you wanted to keep an audio note. And all of those are saved here in your account on Scrimba. So pause now, answer the questions through this quiz, and then you can hit play and we'll go through the quiz together. Number 1, what do props help us accomplish? Well, just like parameters being passed into a function, props being passed into a component help us make that component more reusable. As you become more and more experienced in React, you'll realize that there are times when it makes a lot of sense to pass props into a component so that it's reusable, and other times when it might be possible to pass props into a component, but it's just not always necessary. I can't tell you how much time I have spent trying to create a component that's very reusable and then ended up only using it 1, maybe 2 times. That's just one of those things that will come with experience as you write more and more React code. Remember, when we pass props into a component, it could be data that actually gets displayed as a part of that component, or it could sort of be like metadata that you're passing into the component that in a way configures it to act a certain way. Either way, it helps us make any component that we create more reusable so that we can keep our code as dry as possible. Okay, so number 2, how do you pass a prop into a component? In the same way that you pass attributes to HTML elements, like a source attribute for an image, you essentially do the same thing when you're passing props to a component. So if I have my own component like, let's say, my awesome header, I'm using a strange name just to make it very clear that this is a custom one. You can pass a prop of your own choosing, like maybe title, into that component. That brings us to number 3. Can I pass a custom prop, like, for example, blah, 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 to a native DOM element? So, for example, a div with a lowercase d. Well, the answer is no. So we come to the next part, why not? And that's because under the hood, when React sees a regular HTML element that we're trying to render, we express that element through the JSX syntax, and that JSX syntax actually returns an object, and the object describes the actual DOM node that should be created. When we add an attribute to a regular DOM element like a lowercase d div, the object that this JSX creates is expecting to be able to add this property to the DOM element. And since DOM elements don't have an attribute called blah, 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 I can't just choose the props that I want to add to native DOM elements like this div. So let me try typing out a summary of that. So the answer is no, because the JSX that we use to describe those native DOM elements we want React to create will eventually be turned into real DOM elements, and real DOM elements don't have whatever properties, let's say properties, or attributes specified in the HTML specification, which, as we all know, doesn't include properties like blah, blah, blah. Okay, I think we understand that concept. How do I receive props in a component? Simply enough, the parameters to that component function will receive a value called props, which of course we could name whatever we want, but by very strong convention will be props. And that leads us to the last question, which is what data type is props in the component when I receive it? This parameter, which we're calling props, is an object, which means if I want to access the properties of that object, I use .syntax. So props dot whatever the prop was that I passed in. Let's use blah, 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 because that's what we said before. Okay, awesome job on that quiz. If you struggled with any of these questions, of course, don't hesitate to go back and review the things that we've recently learned. And when you're ready, let's move on. At this point in the course, you should be somewhat familiar with the concept of object destructuring. However, just in case, we'll do a quick recap. Say I have an object called person. In ES6 and later, I can destructure the properties of that object in order to get simpler to use variable names. For example, if I wanted to log person.phone, I obviously could just use console log person.phone and everything would work just fine. However, in certain circumstances, it can be nice to destructure this object and pull out the property names for your own use. that looks kind of like this. I might say const, and then I'll use an object syntax, say image, comma, name, and then set that equal to person, my object. What that does is it declares two new variables, img and name, which I can then use in order to, say, console log the name. If I open the console, you can see I'm getting Mr. Whiskerson here. So that's the concept of object destructuring. The reason I bring that up is that it's a fairly common thing to do this in React with the incoming props that you receive. The parameter that you put inside of your component will be an object that represents all of the props that your component received. So what I could decide to do is just destructure that object immediately as I receive it inside of my function here, which means that I could say curly braces, image, name, phone, and email. It's important to note that I can't rename this to something else like image unless I do a little bit of trickery using colons, like image, colon, image. But we're not going to be too concerned about that for now. The point being, I don't get to change the name of the prop while I'm bringing it in. I need to make sure that it's exactly as the prop was being passed in at the time that the component was being rendered. If I decide to destructure my object like this, then I will need to change some of my code here. You can see if I refresh, suddenly I get an error that says props is not defined. So let me give you a challenge to fix it. Okay, your challenge is to fix our bug now that we've destructured the props object. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, by destructuring our props, we're essentially declaring four new variables up here: image, name, phone, and email. So instead of props.image, I can just reference image and name and phone and email. I hit save and everything should be back to normal. Yep, there we go. The main reason I wanted to show this is just because you will certainly run into React code that either has the full object of props written here, or very commonly the destructured object, which pulls out each of the individual components, or rather properties, of the props object. Frankly, you can write it either way. In my own personal experience, I've experimented with both ways, and in the end, I've found it a little bit easier, in my opinion, to put the props object here and then reference props.image and name and so forth. The only reason being, if I decide to declare other variables inside of my component, let's say right here, it becomes less apparent which variables came in as props and which ones were declared inside of my component. So that's my reasoning for usually sticking to putting the whole props object. It does cause a little bit more of the clutter here by having props dot everywhere, but honestly, that's okay with me. Whichever way you choose, just try to be consistent with it. There certainly are other things that we will learn about props as we go forward, but now it's time for you to get your hands on the keyboard and start practicing the things that we've learned about props. Well, it's been a minute since we've started a new React app totally from scratch. So one last time, I promise the last time I'm going to make you do this, I want you to set up a React app completely from scratch. I guess as a reminder, Scrimba is doing a little bit of magic for us. When we pull in these dependencies, it's setting up our React app basically for us, but I just mean in the coding part. I want you to get a little more practice on doing that from scratch. You can read through the challenge for the specifics on what you're supposed to do. There's also some extra credit down here that would be worth looking into if you're interested and if you were able to do this top part all by yourself. And although I would like you to include your own favorite jokes and maybe share it on Twitter or in Discord, I did include some jokes for you to use just in case you didn't have any jokes on hand that you knew of. So pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Since we've done this a number of times, I am going to move through this fairly quickly. So I'm going to import React from React and import React DOM from React-DOM. We're going to use React DOM to render an app component, which I haven't yet created, but will in just a second. And we'll render it to that div with the ID of root. I'll also import an app component, which isn't yet created, so I will create a new file called app.js. Inside of app.js, again, I'll import React from React. Anytime we need JSX in our code, then I'm going to import React. and I will export my component. For now, I'll just do a quick sanity check. We'll do an H1 that says hi. Okay, good. We're showing up on the screen. You might notice too, I included some basic styling. I changed the font just to switch things up a little bit. Okay, and then it says to have the app component render 4 or 5 joke components. So I will kind of work backwards. We'll have this return a div that surrounds our 5 joke components. And those don't exist, so first I need to import them from a file called joke. And then I need to actually create that file. So in joke.js, again, import React from React, export default our joke component. Okay, we'll have this return a little sanity check H1 for us. Joke here. Hit save. Okay, our 5 joke components are being rendered correctly and showing up on the screen. Now, if you did struggle at any point in just this part of the setup, I really recommend that you just go back, spend the additional time you need to revisit what we've talked about so far. Everything here should not be confusing at this point in the course, and if it is, it's okay. You just probably should go back and revisit some of the stuff that we've learned already. Okay, now comes the practice for actually using our props. We know that we need a setup prop, and I actually copied these already, so I'm just going to paste in the setups for these jokes. And then we have a punchline. Now I can tell that my punchline is going to make each of these a little bit too long. So while I'm here, I'm going to put these on their own lines. Okay, and then I have all the punchlines copied as well. Now think for a second, I haven't hit save yet. Think for a second, what is going to change, if anything, on my screen here? If you said nothing's going to change, then you're right. And that's because I am passing props in, but my component is not making use of them at all. So let's do that. I'm going to receive the props. Just for giggles, let's take a look at what console logs when I console log these props. We see we get 5 instances of the props object. So really quick question, if I typed console log 1 time, how come I'm getting 5 console logs? Well, just like any function, whenever I run it, it will run this console log. And in our case, because we have 5 instances of a joke component, it's running this joke function 5 times. Now, because props is an object, I can access the setup and the punchline through dot syntax. I can say props.setup and props.punchline. Let's make this not an H1, but a div. And I don't know, let's make these H3s maybe. And I'll separate each one with a little horizontal rule. Now, here's another check for you. If you weren't able to get to this point, I want you to think now, how am I going to actually make my setup and my punchline display on the screen? In fact, you can pause here and actually make that happen. Well, I can't just say props.setup because, of course, that will make it literally put the text props.setup on the screen. To insert our JavaScript value inside of my JSX, I just need to wrap it in curly braces. I'll do the same thing here. We'll say props.punchline. And I need to make sure I spell that right. And let's hit save. And awesome, we get everything showing up. Now, one thing I just thought of, I might want to change this to something like a paragraph just to change the boldness between these two or give it a little bit of contrast between the setup and the punchline. And I think that that hits all of the points from our original challenge here. Go ahead and delete this. Now we come to the extra credit. And if you were able to complete this extra credit, then you're pretty far ahead because we haven't yet taught things like conditional rendering. But I did think that I would just give you a little sneak peek on it. So here's an example of one of my favorite jokes that's just a one-liner here. Over in app.js, I'm going to create another instance of a joke, and I'll put it at the top so we can see it more readily. Now, in this case, there really isn't a setup for this one. It's just a punchline. So what's going to happen if I just include a punchline? Well, we can see that I really don't have anything being rendered up above here. However, if we did go into the DevTools, we would see that up above this paragraph, there's actually an empty H3 sitting up here. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal the way we currently have things set up. But what if I went to my joke and instead of just putting the setup and the punchline, I said something like setup, and punchline, Now when I hit refresh, we can see that, well, it's a little bit broken here. Again, this isn't something that we've taught, so I didn't necessarily expect you to fully grasp this concept quite yet. But as an advanced sneak peek into conditional rendering, something that I can do is actually only render this H3 if props.setup exists. One really concise way that we're going to learn about is to surround my JSX in curly braces, which means that I'm putting it inside of a JavaScript interpretation. And then I can say props.setup and this H3. We're going to learn about how a lot of the neat little tricks that we can do with React are just using vanilla JavaScript principles, and this is a good example of that. This is saying that if props.setup is a truthy value, then render the thing on the right side of my AND operator here. If it's a falsy value, however, it won't render anything at all. So I can hit save and it will look very similar to the way that it looked before. Again, we're going to talk more in depth about that. It doesn't need to make perfect sense quite yet. And one of the cool things about this is we could decide to do it in another way. For example, what if instead of conditionally rendering it this way, I decided to say, well, the style of this H3 is that it has a display of none when props.setup does not exist. Well, I could do that with something like a ternary. I could say the display, if props.setup does exist, then I want it to be block, but otherwise I want it to be none. Obviously, this is a much more convoluted way than what we just saw, but it essentially accomplishes the same thing. The point is we can use those props and vanilla JavaScript principles like a ternary operator or this more concise AND operator to accomplish our goals. I'm hoping this was a helpful practice. I'm really looking forward to seeing people's best jokes. And when you're ready, there's still one more little thing we're going to learn about props before we can finally take all of this and apply it to our section project. Okay, I'm sorry that we're still here on the jokes, but I realize there's one more thing we need to cover before we jump back into our section project. And that is, how can we pass a prop that is not just a string? The concept of props, like we talked about, is very similar to the concept of attributes in HTML. And with HTML, we always pass in a string as our data type here. However, we are not limited by that in React. So far, we've only done strings. However, because this is JavaScript, it's React, which is JavaScript, we can pass in any JavaScript data type to our components as props. So I want you to think critically here. How might you pass in a prop that wasn't a string data type? Let's say, for example, you want a number passed to each one of these jokes that eventually will represent the number of upvotes and downvotes for this joke. Or maybe you want to pass in an array of comment objects. And then you might say, I want to allow people to filter out the puns or only show the puns in my jokes. In which case I might pass a prop called isPun, which is the value true or false, not the string true or false, but the actual Boolean value true or false. Accomplishing this uses something that you've already learned at this point. And so I want you to try and think critically. See if you can figure out how you would pass in a non-string value as the prop to your component. And be curious with it, play with it. Actually give it a try, don't just think about it. Pause here and see if you can figure that out. We learned previously that we can jump back and forth between JavaScript and JSX by using curly braces. And the same thing works with our props. For example, these three jokes here are all puns. So if I wanted to indicate that, I could say isPun equals, and then jump into JavaScript and send in a Boolean value like true. And then I can do the same thing for these others. And then of course, for the ones that are not puns, I can change this to the JavaScript value, Boolean value of false. And then do the same thing for my jokes up here up top. Actually, I'm struggling now to think if this joke is a pun or not. This might be a pun, because it's talking about puns. Anyway, you get the point. By introducing these curly brackets, I can put any JavaScript value in here. So again, if I wanted to pass in a number, I could say upvotes is 10, downvotes is 2. And if I had an array of comments, I could say comments equals, and then this can get as complicated as I want. I can say an array of objects, and maybe those objects have an author property, and it's got some author ID, and then the body of the comment itself, and then maybe there's even a title to the comment and whatnot. Of course, it's an array, so it could be multiples of those and so forth. I can even put JavaScript expressions in here to determine what the value being passed into the props should be. That's getting a little bit more advanced than I want to jump into now, but the point is these curly braces essentially give us free rein to throw any JavaScript we want inside of the curly braces, and whatever that JavaScript expression resolves to is the value that the prop will pass down to our component. So let me fix my syntax error here and go over to my joke component, and let's just console log props.isPun, and you'll see we get a bunch of Boolean values. I could even do props.comments.title. And actually, that's going to cause an error because I didn't pass a comments prop to all of them. But let's do props.comments. And we'll see we get a bunch of undefines, but one of them has an array of objects. So I think you get the point. That's going to help us as we go back to our Airbnb experiences clone. So that's what we're finally going to jump back into now. Okay, we're finally back to our Airbnb experiences clone. Your challenge is to pass these props that I've outlined here into our card component, and then inside of our card component, receive those props and make use of them. As a little bit of a hint and a heads up, there's a couple instances that we're not passing in strings, or strings that we are passing in that we need to slightly modify in order for them to work. I guess so that's not too cryptic, the image that we're passing in here, you'll notice, is only the title of the image file. It doesn't include any path to the image itself. The astute of you might know that what we're doing here still is requiring us to hardcode data into our component, and in the real world, that's not what we're going to do. However, we haven't quite gotten there yet. In an upcoming lesson very soon, we're going to see a way that this would actually be structured a little more realistically. But I want to get your hands on the keyboard practicing, like I always say. So work on this challenge until you can show our card component looking essentially exactly the way it is now, but without the hard-coded data inside of the card itself. Pause here and start on that. Okay, I already know that I'm going to have too many props to put on one line, so I'm just going to start them on the next line. And we'll set the image equal to this string. I'm going to copy and paste these just so I don't make a fool of myself making a typing error. The rating is going to be 5.0. Now, this is a string right now. I suppose if we were ever planning on doing math on this rating, then it might be sensible to change it into a floating point number here by surrounding it with curly braces like that. I'm not going to be too concerned about it at this point. The review count, maybe just for good measure, and because I didn't put quotes around the 6 up here, I'll send in a number. The country will say USA, mostly because Katie Zafiris is from the USA. For the title, we'll once again copy this. And the price I'm going to send in as a number. We'll say 136. In this case, I don't think it makes a huge difference because I'm not going to be doing any math on this number probably, but what the heck, just for good practice. Okay, I can clean up this challenge, but I do need to now go to my card component, and the very first thing I should do is actually receive props here. And maybe just so I'm not flipping back and forth between the files to see which props I sent in, I'm going to console log the props so that I can see them down in my console. And that will give me a chance to actually look at the properties that I sent in. Now, right away, we run into a little bit of a challenge. Like I mentioned, we're only passing in the file name and extension. We're not passing in the whole path. But I can't just do string concatenation like saying ... / images / and then plus my props .image, because this plus is not going to make sense. Now, I could do that by surrounding this entire thing here in curly braces, but I'm going to make use of the ES6 templating string syntax with these backticks, and that way I can put my $ curly braces. Now this is probably starting to get confusing. Inside of a template string, I can insert values by using $ curly braces, and that's where my props.image will go. However, I can't just put backticks surrounding everything here because that doesn't make sense in JSX. Now this is the tricky part. If I surround the backticks because they are a JavaScript expression in curly braces, then suddenly this expression makes sense. I think this is probably the trickiest part of this challenge. I'm hoping it didn't frustrate anyone too much, but I totally understand if it did because it's a confusing back and forth. Remember, up here we're in JavaScript, then we jump into JSX, then with the curly braces we jump back into JavaScript, and that's why I can use my backticks. Inside of JavaScript and inside template strings, I can use the $ curly braces to insert JavaScript values into this string. I think it's called interpolation. I end my backtick and then I get out of JavaScript and I jump back into JSX. Hopefully you could follow all that. I understand if that's confusing. The rest of this should be really pretty straightforward. My rating is right here. Instead of putting a hard-coded 5.0, I can put my curly braces, props.rating. Instead of my 6, and I'm actually going to just put in my curly braces inside of my parentheses here, I'm going to put props.reviewCount. Again, the parenthesis is still part of JSX and therefore will be interpreted as text. The curly brace gets me into JavaScript, which is why I can then put my JavaScript value, and then I get out of JavaScript and I have my second parentheses to surround it. My country, I can put props.country. In this paragraph, we'll put props.title. And right here for the number, I'm going to leave the $ because I still want that to exist. However, the price that I'm passing in is just the number 136. So I will put props.price. Okay, moment of truth. Let me get us a little extra working room here. I'll hit refresh, and awesome. Everything looks like it is still working the same. Now, it does kind of look like we don't have this space showing up after our dot, but we won't be too concerned about that right now. Okay, last thing, I'm going to clean up my console log up here. And excellent. We now have a reusable component as long as every time I create an instance of my card, I pass in these props. I should be able to get different cards showing up in my list. Really great work. If you were able to follow along with this entire lesson, I really hope that this has been helpful. And hopefully you are just as excited as I am to learn this, because this is giving us more tools in our tool belt, more power for us to create really awesome web applications in React. We obviously have a lot more to learn, but really at this point you should be really excited for everything that you've learned, especially if you're understanding it. If you are feeling lost, of course, as always, go back, revisit these, and ask lots of questions in Discord. Coming up, we're going to be addressing that issue where currently we are still hard-coding this data into our code here. And so that's the next topic we're going to tackle. This is a total spoiler alert into what we're about to learn with React, and that is how to use the .map method to take regular JavaScript data and turn it into JSX elements that React can render. So I figured at this point it would be a great opportunity to revisit the map method just in case it's been a while since you've used it, or especially if you've never really understood it in the first place. If you fall into that latter group, then I highly recommend you go check out the MDN docs on map, look through the examples, play with the code, and work with it until you at least grasp a basic understanding of the syntax for it. Because you should already know .map by now, I'm going to assume that that's the case, and we're going to work through these challenges. Instead of having you do all of the challenges right away at once, I'm going to let you do challenge number 1, and then we'll go over it together, and then I'll have you do challenge 2, we'll go over it together, and then challenge 3, we'll go over it together. So, of course, we'll start at the beginning with challenge 1, pause the screencast, and work on this challenge. So as a refresher, map is a method on every array. Because I've declared nums to be an array, nums has a method called .map. .map is a higher order method, which means that it takes a function as its main parameter. This is a great example of a method that is declarative, because under the hood, .map is going to handle the regular for loop for us, and all we need to do is provide a function that the map method can use to run on every single item inside of the array. Whatever we return from this function as part of our return here is what will get placed in the same index in a brand new array. And in the end, nums.map is going to return a new array, so I need to save that array in a variable. We'll say const squared equals the array that gets returned from nums.map. An important part of this is that the function I provide to .map is going to receive each of the items in the array one at a time as .map loops over the array for us and runs this function. So if I were to, for example, console log item, I would see that I get each of the original items in the array, and they each show up on their own line because this console log is running 5 separate times. So all we have to do is simply return item squared. I could use the math library, or I could just say item times item. And now if I console log squared, I should get this array, which was my original goal. And sure enough, there it is. Okay, that was just to get our feet wet. This next one has a little bit extra challenge, includes potentially some string methods, but again, it's just a regular JavaScript challenge. Pause the screencast and work on challenge number 2. Okay, just like before, we'll create a variable to hold our destination array, or our returned array. Let's call it uppercase, and we'll get that by using names.map. Now above I used a function declaration like this, but this time I'm going to use an arrow function just to simplify my code a little bit. It's essentially the same. I can open it up and use return. I'll fix this later for anybody that's yelling at me that I can simplify this even more. And inside my function, I'm going to be receiving an item. Now I could call it item, or I think a little more intuitively, I'll call it a name. In fact, usually I would call this item probably num or number. Let's call it num just to kind of clean that up, make it obvious what we're working with. Now with the name, what I want to return is the first letter capitalized in that string. Now I'll be totally honest, string methods are not something I usually just have memorized. I usually end up looking them up. I'm gonna wing this and see how it works. Essentially what I'm trying to return is the first index, so I'll say name at the index of 0 dot to uppercase. And that should be a string of the first letter that's now capitalized, and then I'm going to add name dot, I think slice will do it, and I'll start at the index of 1, which I think will give me the rest of the name starting at index 1 inclusive. Again, this is kind of a shot in the dark, so we'll see how this goes. Console log uppercase. And oh, I was so close. I think I just need to add my parentheses here. Awesome. I probably could have done something like name.slice 0, 1 maybe, and then change that to uppercase. I also could have done something a little more complex, like surrounding these in template strings and then using interpolation to figure that out. And that might help me get rid of my plus. Now I'm just kind of playing around. Nope, there's my space. I don't need a space. Okay, that to me is a lot less readable than what I had before, so I'm going to keep it this way. I guess that's one of the fun things about these challenges. You can try to solve it in multiple different ways. Okay, let's clean this up. I'm going to comment this out, and I'll send you now to challenge number 3. Just to clarify, because we're just working in regular JavaScript here, I'm not expecting this to work in React or JSX or anything. Essentially, all we're doing is taking this string and then adding what looks like paragraph tags, the opening and closing tags, on the beginning and the end of that string. Of course, this is leading to a point that will then take us to React. Pause the lesson here and start working on challenge number 3. Okay, let's say maybe const elements, even though these aren't real elements. And that's going to be pokemon.map. I'll use my arrow function again, and this time because I'm only going to be using a single parameter, let's see, I think Pokemon is both singular and plural, right? Maybe I'll say mon for monster. Because I only have a single parameter, I can get rid of those parentheses and just put my arrow here. And, well, before I simplify the rest, let me actually open this up and we'll do it the way we did it before, and then we'll clean it up. Now, this time around, I think it probably will be easier to use a template string, so I'm going to put my paragraph text here, and then inside of my paragraph text, I will put my monster's name. Let's console log elements, make sure that this is going to look the way we expect, and awesome, that looks great. Now, regarding cleaning things up, because an arrow function has the ability to have an implicit return, if I start that return on the same line as the arrow, I can clean this up that way. I can also do the same up here, get rid of my explicit return, make it implicit, and because I only have one parameter, I can get rid of those parentheses. If you're still feeling hazy with arrow functions, don't worry, I'm kind of with you there. But once you do get used to them, they can really provide a nice, simple syntax for you to perform operations that otherwise might take a number of lines of code. That's another one of the benefits, like I mentioned, of having declarative methods like .map. It's handling the for loop for us. We simply have to follow the rules, and we get back exactly what we expect. Now, again, what we're ending with here looks like an array of HTML elements. In fact, if we were to be doing regular DOM manipulation, we probably could use these using the inner HTML method to have the browser actually turn these element strings or DOM strings into real HTML elements on the screen. But since we're not doing that and we're doing React, we're going to see how we can basically use this exact same principle to take data from an array and turn it into JSX elements that get displayed on our screen. There's one more really small step that I want to cover before we get there, so let's cover that next. I think now is probably a good time to remember that JSX just returns a regular JavaScript object. We can see that if I were to set, let's say, a new variable called element equal to some JSX, and we'll say just an h1. And then if I console log element, what we actually get back is just a plain old JavaScript object. The properties and the shape of this object get determined by React in order to describe the element that React eventually will be turning into a real DOM node that shows up on our screen. But the reason that I mention this is because when you get deeper and deeper into web development, and actually programming in general, you'll discover that most arrays don't end up being an array of simple strings like we sometimes use for examples like this. Instead, it's probably most common to find arrays end up being an array of objects. Let's keep this example simple. We'll say it's a first name and a last name in this object. That's because data is usually a lot more complicated than just what can be represented by a simple string, and so we use objects to represent pieces of data in a lot more detail. Well, there's a little special feature of React, and that is that if we provide an array into what we're rendering from our component, React will know how to essentially map over that array and turn it into elements. Let me clean some of this up and show you a little bit more what I mean. Let's say we create this array of colors, and I'm just going to put in the colors of the rainbow. Of course, I just got done mentioning that usually we don't have an array of strings, but this is just to illustrate a point. Inside of my return, when I'm returning the elements that I actually want to put on the page, I can give React this array and let it render it to the page. Now, I can't just say colors because then it's going to put the actual word colors on there, so I'll surround it in curly braces, and now essentially what it's going to do is copy this. Basically, I could have just done this in its place. So we'll take this one step at a time. Let's look at it this way. Now, obviously, this is not beautiful, and we can tell already that it's essentially just putting these together as blank text. I haven't taught React that I want these to be paragraphs or headers or ordered lists or anything like that. Now, of course, if I do want to use my variable colors up here, I can essentially just put colors here, and I still, of course, need my curly braces here. When I hit save, I get the same result. But now I want you to do a little challenge to experiment with what will happen if you change these from strings into JSX elements. Okay, simple enough. I just want you to essentially change these strings into JSX elements, and I said H3. You can do whatever element you want. Then I want to make sure that you hit save or refresh and see exactly how what we have currently changes when you do that. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, maybe this is getting into the realm of busy work, but let me do this really quick. Okay, let's see what happens when I hit save. Awesome. Now I actually got a list of JSX elements that are being displayed as H3s. In some ways, it's kind of like React took the elements here and just copied and pasted them onto the screen. Of course, I would need to get rid of all these commas for that to work correctly, but I get the same result this way. But let's put it back to colors so that it works the way it's supposed to work. Okay, now we are poised to take what we just talked about and reviewed with .map and what we just learned about where React can render an array of JSX elements and put those concepts together, which will allow us to, instead of hard coding our data directly into our components like we're doing here, instead we can get data from outside of our little system, map over it, and render a new component for every piece of data. In other words, in the next screencast, we're going to see a jokes.js file, which has essentially the same thing, but in a JavaScript array of objects. Then we'll get to pull those in and map over them, create an array of JSX elements, and then render those to the screen. So when you're feeling ready, let's go forward. Let me walk you through a couple of changes I've made to the code that we were just looking at. Of course, you probably noticed I moved all of our hard-coded joke components outside of our component here and just commented them out so we can still reference them. I've also changed our jokes.markdown file into a jokesdata.javascript file. Now, we're not quite ready to make API calls and then make use of the data that comes back, so I'm going to be kind of mimicking that with this jokes.js file that's exporting an array of these joke objects. Over in our app.js, I'm going to import the jokes, I'll say jokes data, from that file, /jokes_data. And we can see that if I console log jokes data, I should get the array of jokes. Okay, great. Now combining what we just learned with .map and with creating an array of JSX elements, I can put those two concepts together. What I'm going to do is create a variable, let's call it joke elements. And this is going to be not an array that I'm defining right now, but instead the array that gets returned when I call jokesdata.map. Inside of my .map, I'm going to take a look at each one of my joke objects, and what I can return, I'll do this on its own line just so we can see a little more clearly what's happening. I'm going to return a joke component. However, I can pass the data from this individual joke object to my joke component. So maybe this is a good opportunity for you to put on your thinking cap and do a quick little challenge. Your challenge is to see if you can pass the props to our joke component in the correct way, and then of course render our joke elements array so that when you're all done, all of our jokes show up on the page again. Pause the screencast and see if you can complete this challenge. Each of the joke objects that I am looking at inside of my .map is each of these objects that we see here. So they have a setup property and a punchline property, which means over here I can say my joke has a setup prop, and this has to be spelled exactly this way because our joke component is expecting props.setup. This setup prop will be equal to, and then I need to use my curly braces because I'm leaving JSX and going into JavaScript. We'll say joke.setup. Now it just so happens that I'm using the same name for the prop that I'm passing to my joke component, props.setup, and the object property that I chose in my actual data setup here. However, it's not always going to be the case that these are the same. If, for example, these were question instead, then over in app.js, I would still say setup because I'm the one that gets to choose what the prop name for my component is, but then my actual data would need to change to joke.question. question. Now, a question doesn't always make sense in this case because they're not all questions, but hopefully that illustrated a point. And next I will need my punchline. And this is going to be joke.punchline. Again, because the actual data has a punchline property in each of these joke objects. Now I'm not quite done. I can hit save. Nothing's going to show up on the screen, and that's because I'm still returning an empty div in my app component. The last thing I need is just to render my joke elements, hit save, and there we go. We've got all of our jokes back on the page. Now, if I clean some of this up, you can see just how much simpler this makes our lives as React developers. And then if I were being really stingy, I could use the implicit return to just return my joke element. I'm not going to worry too much about that, especially because it makes it a little too wide horizontally there. Awesome. Okay, we have taken a number of asides. Once again, I'm going to bring us back to our Airbnb experiences clone, and we're going to take this concept and actually build the separate experiences in their own cards. This time using data that we get from a file instead of hard coding things into our code. Make sure you have studied this and understand it before you move on, and when you're ready, let's jump back into our section project. All right, it's time for another quiz. We're going to look at the .map array method, read through these questions, click into the editor, type down your answers, and when you're ready, click play and we'll go through the quiz together. Number 1, what does the map array method do? And I'm referring here to JavaScript in general, not specifically React. Well, the array map method takes a function as its parameter, and whatever gets returned from that function will be placed in the same index of a brand new array. So maybe let's say it returns a new array, and whatever gets returned from the callback function provided is placed at the same index in the new array. And well, yeah, that's good enough. Theoretically speaking, our callback function, we could just hard code something like return the string hello, and then we would have an array filled with hellos. But usually what we're trying to do is take items from the original array and modify them in some way. In fact, maybe I'll type that down. With that in mind, number 2 asks, what do we usually use .map for in React? Well, in web applications, it's really common for us to have an array of raw data, usually an array of objects, and to want to turn that array of data into something that's visible on the screen. So in React, we'll take an array of data, we'll map over it, and turn each of those items into some kind of JSX element that gets put on the page. So more concisely, it allows us to convert an array of raw data into an array of JSX elements that can be displayed on the page. And number 3, why is using .map better than just creating the components manually by typing them out and putting the props in that we want? Using .map in this way is a lot more dry. Obviously, if you think in terms of something like Amazon, every time a new product is uploaded to Amazon and Amazon sells that product, there isn't a developer out there who's going to go copy and paste the elements from a product and then put in different props, let's say. No, instead, the data will change, and using something like .map will automatically convert that raw data into something that gets displayed on the page. One way you could put it, like I wrote here, is that it makes our code more self-sustaining in a way, meaning that it doesn't require additional changes whenever the data also changes. It makes me think of when we're typing out a C-style for loop and we say something like for, let I equal 0, and then we use I is less than some array dot length. This makes it so that if the length of the array ever were to change, our for loop would not require intervention. Instead, it would automatically check the length of the array, and that's what it uses in this parameter in the for loop. Alternatively, if I just said something like I is less than 5, but I'm looking through the elements of an array that maybe now has, let's say, 10 elements in it, my for loop is broken and it requires intervention from a programmer. I think you probably understand, so I'm just going to erase this for loop and leave it where it is. Awesome work on this quiz. Hopefully you were able to answer all of these questions. When you're ready, let's move on and start applying what we just learned to our section project. I am coming to you from the future again because in the next challenge, for anybody who is following along using Create React App on their local machine instead of following along here in Scrimba, the upcoming challenge might throw you for a bit of a loop, technically speaking. What we're about to do is go back to the Airbnb project and use a data file that includes links to the local images so that you can map over it and display those images as well as the other pieces of data. And you'll see that just kind of works out of the box here in Scrimba. But if you're following along with Create React App, you'll get something that looks more or less like this. Obviously, this is not ideal. The last time that I spoke to using Create React App, I mentioned how it's gently advised against putting any assets inside of the public directory. However, this is an instance where I'm just going to recommend that you put your images inside of your public directory. I'm going to go to the next slide. This has an animated GIF that might take a minute for some people to load. But you can see that what it's doing is it's taking the images directory from the source folder and moving it up into the public folder. The reason I'm recommending doing this is, well, first of all, normally you're not going to have a data file that includes all of the data you need. Instead, you would actually be getting that data from some online resource. And second of all, because it just magically works. When you move the images to the public folder, things just kind of start working again. So that was just a quick heads up for anybody using Create React App. If you're following along here in Scrimba, you really don't have to worry about any of that for now. Okay, with that said, let's jump in. Okay, it all comes down to this. We are going to put all the things that we just learned together to progress our section project here with the Airbnb Experiences clone. I've written out your task here, and let me walk you through just a couple things. First of all, there's now a data.js file, and this contains an array of the objects that represent the data that we're going to be displaying on the screen. Part of your task is to import that data as it mentions, map over it to create our card components, kind of like we have hard-coded here, and then render that array in place of this card component. One little change that I did make is I changed the country prop to location, and I also made that change in the data here. So in case you were curious about why that's changed, I just decided it made more sense since we might have some online experiences. And another thing is you'll notice there are some properties here that we won't yet be using, like open spots or description. That's okay. For now, just ignore those. We'll decide later if we want to make use of them. Also, as I mentioned in the note here, because we haven't done styling to our group of components or anything like that yet, they're going to stack on top of each other because they're block element divs. For now, that's okay. Don't worry about them being stacked vertically. We'll fix that later. Okay, now is the time. I know that you can do it. You've worked hard up until this point. Hopefully you have studied and rewatched everything you needed to in order to understand what we're doing. So let's jump right in, pause the screencast, and work on the challenge. All right, let's do this. First, I need to import my data, and I probably will just stick with the word data as my variable name here. So we'll say import data from ./data. And maybe just before I get too far down the road, I'll console log this just to make sure that I'm getting the data I think I'm getting. Okay, yeah, that looks right. Again, as a quick reminder, usually you won't be importing a hard-coded data file. We'll be covering API calls and how to get data from an online source later. But until we learn a couple more things, we're not going to be able to do anything really except for importing our data. Then down in our component, I don't want to erase this comment because that's my whole hero section that we commented out for space sake before. Let's take our data and, I don't know, maybe call them cards. We'll say cards is equal to data.map, and we'll let map look over each of those experiences. Maybe I'll just call it item for now. And then for each item in that array, I want to return, well, let me just copy this here because it's got all the properties that I want. And then instead of having these hard-coded values, I will just replace them with the values from our object. So let me just make sure that I get all these properties right. We have, this is called cover image, not image. So I guess some of these might change. So that's cover image. Again, this is another instance where the data had a different property than what we chose to call our prop that we're passing into our component. That's entirely okay. and actually ends up being pretty common, especially if you're not thrilled with the way that the data was designed. Oftentimes you're consuming data that someone else has put in their database and you don't get to choose these property names. Okay, our rating. Let's look at our data. Now we have this stats property, and that's where our rating is. So we're going to have item.stats.rating, and similarly with review count, item.stats.review count. So here, item.stats.rating and item.stats.review count. Okay, in the data we have location, that's going to stay the same, so location will just be location, item.location. Title, I believe, was item.title, and this, I believe, was item.price. Let's just double check those. I like to double check them because otherwise I might see missing data and then get really confused about why it's not working. Title, price, title, and price. Okay, now that we have created our array of card components, we need to render it. So let's get rid of our hard-coded card. I'll put curly braces because I need to enter into JavaScript here. My array of JSX elements is still considered JavaScript, so I'm going to put that in curly brackets, say cards, hit save, and look at that. We're getting all of our experiences showing up. Of course, again, they're vertically stacked. Each one has its own unique data being displayed, and awesome. At this point, we have covered a bulk of the material from this section that I wanted to cover. And don't get me wrong, we've covered a lot of things so far. There's a lot here to practice with, and as always, if you're not feeling comfortable yet with some of this material, it's important to stick with it, practice it over and over until you understand it. That being said, we do have a couple more things that I want to cover before we finish off this section. First of all, we need to style this, so we'll do that in the next screencast. And then I want to give you a sneak peek into some of the topics we'll be talking about in the next section. So when you're ready, let's polish off our project here with some CSS. Okay, I've got to be honest with you. I was going to have you style the list of cards here so that they would horizontal scroll inside of a container. But we've already spent a pretty fair amount of time doing CSS inside of React. And so for all the hard work and effort that you have put in so far, I've got a little present for you. Bam! We've got the styling done. Of course, if you're interested to see how I did this, basically I made a flex container, made it so that none of the items would grow or shrink as the container got bigger or smaller, and then just set the overflow to scroll, essentially. You can check the CSS for the details on it. I've also included little tags that will tell you exactly what I added so that you could easily see what actually changed. Also notice that I used a section element here to surround our cards. That allowed me both to give this a class name and give it specific styling, but it also allowed me to make use of our styles that we put way back in the beginning on sections so that it had some padding on the left and right. Now there are two things that I want to talk about here. One is how awesome it is that we are now mapping over our data, because it means that if the data ever changes, our page will automatically update. So if I were to, for example, paste in 3 more items here, I just copied the one and pasted it again, and then updated, our page is going to automatically update with all of the new activities that are included in our data. Clearly, this is a much better way to work as a developer where the data will change and your page doesn't need to. Your code actually stays exactly the same, and all that really updates is how that data is being used to display your elements on the screen. The second thing that I want to cover is this error that we have been seeing, or rather a warning that we've been seeing that says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this course to dive deep into why this key prop is necessary, but you will see this warning anytime you are using .map on data to create JSX elements, or rather an array of JSX elements. First, let me go to data.js and get rid of those 3 extra items we had. Now, over on our card, the way we can get rid of this warning is by simply adding a prop called key, and it very specifically needs to be key, K-E-Y. And I need to set key equal to something unique about this individual item. In this case, pretty much everything about these different experiences is unique. The image is different, the title, the price. However, for example, the rating is not different between this first one and the second one, so that's not something I could use as my key because it's not unique. Fortunately, when we're pulling data from a database, almost always we'll receive some kind of ID property that we can guarantee will be unique because the database is creating that as a unique property in the database. Now, obviously, I typed all of this in manually, but I gave it an ID so that we could mimic this concept. Over in app.js, I'm going to assign the key to be item.id. Again, I probably could have used the title or the price for this warning to go away, but when I hit save, we'll see that warning disappears. So those were just a couple of miscellaneous items that I wanted to cover. I'm not going to put our hero back in quite yet because there is one more thing that I want us to talk about, and that touches again on a sneak peek of conditional rendering. And we'll talk about that in the next cast. A phrase you might hear from the React community is that people love React because it's just JavaScript. Now, of course, under the hood, there's things like JSX, which is a little bit of magic being performed by React. But I wanted to show you what that means by giving you another sneak peek at conditional rendering. Now, I've updated the little screenshot that I have here to show you this little badge down here that says sold out. And you might have noticed that in the data, we actually have a property called open spots. Now, I intentionally set this first one to open spots of 0 so that we could conditionally render this little badge if the open spots is ever 0. You might remember from the first time I did a little sneak peek on conditional rendering, the term is referring to when we only will sometimes render a part of our page. Right now, everything on here will render every time this component gets called. However, what we can do is take a look at props, and if props.openspots, let's say, is equal to 0, then we can display the little sold out badge. Otherwise, we just won't display it at all. Now, there's two parts that we need to make this work. First of all, over in app.js, we aren't currently passing in the data from OpenSpots into our card component. So the first thing we need to do is create a new prop called OpenSpots, set that equal to item.OpenSpots. Another thing you may have noticed is that we sure are passing a lot of props into this component. We're going to cover a truncated way to essentially do this same thing without having to add a new prop to our card component every time we want some data from our item. But for now, we'll stick with what we know. So we now have a prop called OpenSpots. We're passing in that number value from our data right here. Now in our card.js, let's just make sure that this is working. I'll go ahead and console log props.openspots and check our console. And sure enough, we get 0, 27, and 3 because that's how many open spots there are for each of our experiences. So let me get back to what I meant by it's just JavaScript. First, let's go ahead and actually create a little badge that will float in the upper left of this image. The way I'm going to do that is by setting my card to be position relative and have a div here that's position absolute. Of course, for now, this div will always show up. We'll fix it so that it conditionally renders as soon as we have something that looks good. Let's go ahead and just hard code in sold out, and I will give it a class name. Let's call it card, probably badge. And honestly, just to save time, I'm going to paste some styles in here so that you don't get too bored. Then on my card, I need to make it position relative, and I need to refresh this. Okay, now obviously it's hard-coded, so every one of these has a sold out badge. And you might remember that the way we handled conditional rendering before was we surrounded our div that we only sometimes want to display in curly braces, and then essentially included a condition beforehand. Now we used a very short version of that condition, which we'll use again. I can say props.openspots equals 0 and the div that I want to render. This is kind of a clever example of how in React we typically use just plain JavaScript to handle things like the display logic that our component needs to know about. If this first statement is truthy, then this second statement, or this JSX element, will run and therefore get displayed. However, if this first statement is falsy, then the second one will actually never even get called or run, and therefore this div will never display on the screen. So if I hit save, we'll see that now I only have a sold out badge on the element that had exactly 0 spots in it. Technically, because 0 is a falsy value, I could say that if not props.openspots, but that's a little less easy for me to read. And if another developer were to come see this, they might expect OpenSpots to be a Boolean. And so I'm going to keep it as triple equals 0 to be very explicit. Now, if you actually go look at the Airbnb Experiences website, you'll notice that even in our design here, we talk about online experiences, and some of our locations are online. The actual website itself has a little badge that says online in order to help people understand that it's going to be, well, probably through a Zoom meeting instead of an in-person live meeting. So I thought I'd show you yet another example of how we can use just plain JavaScript to help determine the display logic of our components here. Right now, I have this badge that says sold out. Now, I could come up with something kind of complicated by putting my display logic in here that says if OpenSpots is 0, then display this div. Otherwise, if the location is online, then display another div. Otherwise, display nothing. But as I was preparing this, I came up with another way that I figured was a little more concise. And so I thought I'd show that here. If you've ever done a code challenge on, well, any number of the websites that exist out there that allow you to practice code challenges, this might feel kind of familiar. My goal is to dynamically render not just this entire div, but also the text inside of it. So I'm going to set a variable using let, and I'll say this is badge text. Then I can just use regular JavaScript and say if props.openspots is equal to 0, then I want badge text to read sold out. Or let's put it all in caps to stay consistent. However, if it's not sold out, I also want it to check if props.location is equal to online. And if it is, then we'll have badge text say online. Now there's two things that I need to change with this line of code in order to make it so that primarily if it's sold out, it has a badge that says sold out. Secondarily, if the location is online, it displays a badge that says online, but otherwise it displays no badge at all. In fact, let's make this a challenge for you. Okay, your challenge is to display the correct badge text instead of this hard-coded sold out. And secondly, to only display the badge when it's either sold out or an online experience. I've given you some hints basically in the language that I used for this challenge number 2. Pause the screencast and work on these challenges. Okay, for the first challenge to display the correct text, all we have to do is erase sold out and instead render whatever the value of badge text is. Now, of course, currently this will only get rendered if OpenSpots is exactly equal to 0. So we also need to change our condition upon which this gets rendered. Kind of a clever way that I thought of was, well, when we initiate badge text up here, its value is going to be undefined. And then if props.openspots is 0 or props.location is online, then badge text will have a real value. I can use the truthiness of a real value or the falsiness of undefined to just say if badge text exists, or rather if badge text has a real value, then I want you to display the badge. Now, maybe this is contrary to what I said before about assuming truthy and falsy values. This one seems a little more logical to me, however. So if I hit save, awesome. Now we have sold out on anything that's sold out. Notice even if it's an online experience, it will prefer sold out first because that's our first condition up here. And then if it does have open spots, but it's online, it has an online badge. And if it's neither, then there's just no badge at all. Now we will be covering conditional rendering in more detail later. However, the point that I'm trying to get across is that in React, we very often use plain JavaScript, like this kind of regular algorithmic JavaScript, to determine how things will get displayed on the page. That might not seem unique or strange to you until you've worked in another framework like Angular or I think Vue as well, where there are actually properties built into the markup that you see that provide logic for using for loops or conditional statements and so forth. I'm not necessarily vying for one over the other, but hopefully this sheds some light into why a lot of proponents of React will say they like it because it's just JavaScript. And along those lines, the next thing we're going to do is go clean up this card component that is getting pretty lengthy. We'll do that in the next lesson. When we have a component that's in charge of maybe displaying one or two pieces of data, it's not that big of a deal to pass each of those pieces of data down individually as separate props. However, we can see our card component is starting to get a bit lengthy, and honestly, we haven't even included things like maybe there's a description or a set of tags that can categorize these experiences. Whatever the case might be, along the theme of React being just JavaScript, what we can opt to do instead of passing each of these properties of our data down individually is we can just say, I'm just going to give this component the entire item object. Notice I kept key here. That's because it's something unique that we need to include anytime we're using map. But for all the other properties of data that I need my card to know about, I'm just going to pass the entire item object down. Of course, because I'm changing the structure of my card, over here, when I hit save, well, everything is broken now. But if at this point you truly have an understanding of how props works and how the things that we pass down to our components can get received by the component, you should be able to complete the following challenge. Fix our component. I'm intentionally being a bit vague here because I want you to challenge yourself. If you have felt a little bit confused about props and what exactly this object is that we're receiving and so forth, this might be a good indicator that it's time to go back and just review the stuff, practice the stuff that we've already learned. But if you have felt pretty confident here, then I want you to pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, one major hint that we can get is if we console log our props. And it might be a little bit confusing to read through here, but you'll notice in the console below that there is an item property in our prop, so props.item, and that item is the object with all of the properties from my data. It might clean it up a little bit if I just log props.item. So with that, it means that all I really need to do is change anywhere I was referring to individual props as a part of the props object, like props.image. I just need to change it to props.item.image. However, we are going to run into one little problem. And what I'll do first is just change everywhere I see props dot to say props.item dot and then the property there. Let me hit save. We'll see where we run into a problem. So it looks like some of it is coming through. We have our title, our price, and our location, but it looks like our review count, our rating, and our image are not working. So if you haven't already figured out why this is broken, I want you to pause the screencast, poke around the code, see if you can figure out how to fix the rest of this component. Because we are passing in the entire item, we now are beholden to exactly the structure and the property names of our data itself. So for example, in our component, we were saying props.img, but in the data, it's the object.coverimg. So if I replace in my card component img with coverimg, now my images should come back. Similarly with review count and rating, these were both part of a sub-object called stats. So if I add stats as a part of my card now, props.item.stats.rating and review count, the rest of that should come back the way we wanted it. Now we can see that our badges are still missing, and that's because way up here when we're doing this logic, we also need to add props.item so that we're correctly looking at item.location and item.openspots. Let's see if that fixes it. Awesome. We're back to the way we were, but now our component as we use it is a lot simpler. Awesome work. We are so close to done. There is one more little tweak to exactly what we've done here that you might see pretty commonly in React, and so I wanted to make sure that I covered that before it became really confusing when you saw it in the wild. So that's what we will cover next. There is one more little trick to passing properties into a component that I wanted to teach you about so that when you see it in the wild, it's not terribly confusing, because if you don't know about it, it looks rather confusing. This trick has to do with the object spread syntax. And if you are either not familiar with it or it's been a minute since you've done it, it's an ES6 feature, and I've linked here the MDN docs on using the spread syntax with object literals. But the idea is that instead of creating my own prop called item that I pass the entire object down through, what I can actually do is just put a set of curly braces and spread the item into my component's props. Essentially what this does is it takes the properties of the data, like ID, title, description, price, cover image, stats, location, and open spots, and creates a separate prop for each one of them, kind of like we had before we were passing in the item individually. So it would look like ID equals item.id, title equals item.title, description equals item.description, and so forth and so on until it has covered every property in our data here, or rather every property in the item that we are passing into our component. Now doing this does fundamentally change exactly what props the card is getting because, well, we just changed props so that it said props.item because it was receiving an item object prop. Doing it this way means we would basically go back to the way that we had it before. So if I were to go back to that, I do curly braces, ... item, which spreads all of the properties of this item as separate props into my card component. Back in my card component, I need to go back and get rid of all of my .items here. Okay, just like that. Oh, I missed a couple here. And actually, you know what? Let me leave those in and we'll see that this is breaking. And well, it looks like it's breaking a little deeper than it was before. So then when I make those changes in the correct way, hit refresh, everything's back to the way that it should be working. On a personal note, I do tend to struggle with this method of passing data down to a component, only because it obscures exactly what we're passing to our component. I personally would rather pass the item down as a very explicit, specific prop that says item is item, and although it does clutter my component a little bit where I have props.item.stats.review_count and whatnot, I tend to find that, at least for myself, when I go back, I don't need to first go to the data, understand what properties are there, then go to app and see that I'm spreading that in, then go to the card and look at what those properties are. I don't know, maybe it's just a personal preference. I have tended toward passing objects down like the way that I've shown you here. For your own sake of review, I'm going to put this back to the spread syntax just so you can see what it looks like as the spread syntax. Hit save so we see that it's still working. I'm sure as you write more and more React, you'll settle on which one you like the most, or maybe just stick to a standard in whatever code base you're working in. I'm going to take a second to clean some of this up so that we buy some more horizontal space. And last but not least, let's go back to our app.js component. Let's bring our hero back in, and let's see how things are looking. Awesome. And that, folks, marks everything that we had planned to learn in this section. So before we keep pushing forward in React, let's take just a minute in the next screencast to look back on everything that we've learned in this section and give you a chance to complete another self-assessment project. Before moving on to the next section, we have another solo project for you to work on. Like we talked about before, it's a great opportunity for you to flex these new skills that you've been working on so far in this section, but this time without the security blanket of me being there to help you. Now, the next section we're about to jump into is the heaviest section of this whole course. So it's especially important at this time that you work on this solo project to help gauge your own skills and then decide if you understand these topics well enough to move on. Again, it's projects like these where the real internalization of everything you've been learning actually happens. So, what's the project this time around? You're going to be building a personal travel journal. It's a page where you can list all the fun places that you've traveled along with some of the details and a photo from your trip. Clicking on the image of this design will take you to the Figma design file. Once you're there, make sure to click on the arrow at the top, choose duplicate to your drafts so that your view of the design file won't be cluttered by anybody else's cursors or selections, and also so you can make any edits to this that you want to make. The quickest way to get started will be to code your project here in Scrimba. If you click away from the Google Slides, you'll see a little menu with 3 dots. When you click that, there will be an option to fork this screencast to a new scrim, which will start you off with the starter code that we have here. Once again, I haven't given you a whole lot. I did put this boilerplate code in here for you, but that's about all that I've done for you. So let's take a look at the project requirements. We haven't yet learned how to pull data from an API, but I do want this page to be data-driven. So you'll be creating an array of this data in a separate JavaScript file, and that array should contain objects which have properties for the title, location, the link for Google Maps, a start date to your trip, end date to your trip, the description, and an image URL. If you're using your own photos, you can actually just drag and drop them into the Explorer in the upper left of this Scrimba environment. And then you can just reference the file name of the image instead of an image URL, or if you want, you could just use an image URL of an image out there on the internet. Just so this was perfectly clear, I gave you a little start here. I just took the data from the design file here on Mount Fuji and created an array with a single object in it. This way you at least know the shape of this object so you can make a copy of it and put in your own data. Once you've pulled in that array, I want you to use the map method and props on some custom components to pass that data down to the custom components and have React display the array that has been mapped. And as is always true in these solo projects, you should make sure that it's styled and really polished. You want this to be something that you would be proud to show to someone else. And of course, speaking of which, make sure that you share your work. Again, you don't have to wait until you're completely done with the project. You can always share your current progress in Discord and ask for some code feedback. You can click the Discord icon here that will take you to the I Built This channel where you can share your work. Or if you're doing something like learning in public on Twitter, you can click this Twitter icon, which will open a pre-populated tweet where you can share a link to your project. Good luck building your travel journal, and I really look forward to seeing everybody's finished projects. We find ourselves here at the end of another section, and all I can think to say is nice work. In this section, you have taken a big stride forward in your understanding of React. Let's look at a quick recap of what we've learned. First, and probably most importantly, we have talked about props in React. Props are one of the most fundamental topics in React, and they really make it so you can write more composable code. You can see in both of our projects, we have elements on our page that are essentially reused, both in the Airbnb Experiences cards here and the Travel Journal cards here. Now that you know the concept of props and reusing components with different data, I guarantee as you start paying attention to the websites and web apps that you use online, you're going to see this concept everywhere. Then what props really enables us to do is use data to drive the code and map over it in order to create the website that we're trying to create. Now, although there's only 2 topics here in this recap, those topics are extraordinarily important as we move forward. As always, you should be extremely proud of what you have worked on so far. So I highly recommend that you go over to the Discord server. If you click on the screenshot, it will take you to the Today I Did channel. And even if you don't feel like sharing your code or a screenshot, at least post a message in there that tells people that you have now completed section 2 of the Introduction to React course. Also, this is a very natural time to take a break from your computer. If you've been working on this for quite a while, make sure that you stand up and move around a bit, get something to eat or drink. Your brain does need some time to digest all of this new information that you've been learning, so even if you need to come back tomorrow, that's completely okay. And then whenever you're ready, I will see you in the next section. You have done an amazing job so far, and now we have arrived at probably the most exciting section in this whole course, and that is how we can create interactive web apps in React. Until now, we have basically just been recreating static websites in React. And of course, along the way, we've also learned how we can use props to create reusable components in React. But really, so far, that's only allowed us to create reusable parts of what is still considered a static website. If you think of the Airbnb Experiences clone that we just finished building, we left it off in a state that really still didn't allow for any kind of interactivity with the user. On the real Airbnb website, a user can click into those experiences, they can save them to their favorites, and then of course they can actually book that experience and pay for it. So that lets us know that there is so much more that we get to do with React. And that's where you've arrived in this section. To help us better understand what I'm talking about, let's take a look at the difference between static websites and dynamic web apps. The static web pages that we've been doing so far, they're really read-only. They don't allow for any kind of changes to the data. And that's probably the defining attribute of a static web page. Especially in the early days of the web, but still pretty common today, you'll find static web pages like a blog, a news site, recipe sites, and a bunch of others that really don't allow you to change any data, but rather just to read or consume the content that exists on the page. In this section, we are going to be learning how we can use React to also create dynamic web applications. And the defining attributes of these web applications is that they are both read and write. In other words, the user has the ability to change the data that drives the app. As such, they tend to be highly interactive, and instead of displaying the same content for every user, they will display your specific data. And these kinds of web apps drive entire businesses. If you think of, for example, your bank website or the real version of Airbnb. And this list goes on and on if you think of social media websites or online games or anything that is highly interactive and displays data that's specific to you as the user. You could say they all exist on a tier sort of above a static website because of the amount of interactivity they have. Of course, we're not quite ready to recreate an entire site like Airbnb, so we'll be using this meme generator project to drive forward the curriculum in this section. In this project, when the app first loads, it's going to reach out to an API and get 100 of the most popular meme images at that time, and give the user the ability to enter the text that shows up on top, the text that shows up on bottom, and also to click a button to randomly choose a new meme image. Just like before, you can click the screenshot here to go to the Figma design file. And again, I recommend you copy it to your drafts. So if you click the arrow at the top, duplicate to your drafts, and choose this option, it will put an editable copy in your own Figma drafts that you can use as reference. In order to build this project, we're going to be learning about event listeners and how we can add that dynamic interactive aspect to our web application. We're going to spend a lot of time learning about something called state. We'll officially cover conditional rendering, which you've already had a few sneak peeks at so far. We'll talk about forms and how we can gather data from the user, and we'll learn about side effects and how we can manage side effects in React. Once again, we'll be starting off by building some of the static components of our page here. So if you already feel like you're 100% good on CSS in React, you can skip the first couple lessons where we're mostly just doing some setup and styling for this app. However, I do encourage you once again, if you haven't been practicing your CSS inside of your React, or honestly, even if you're feeling a little bit hesitant on CSS in general, not specific to React, then don't skip those screencasts. Go through those lessons, do the challenges, and that will be a great way to get some additional practice on those topics and set you up for success with the rest of this project. So click the screenshot to open it in Figma, copy it to your drafts, and when you're ready, let's get started on this section, which I'm the most excited about in this whole course. Sometimes if I'm feeling overwhelmed by a project like the meme generator here, where we haven't learned some of the things we need to know in order to complete it, I will break the app down as much as I can into pieces and then see which of those pieces I actually can create. For example, we've spent this entire course so far learning how to build static React sites. And the truth is there are static parts of this site. So the first one we're going to start with is the header. Remember, you can click this screenshot in order to go to the Figma design, which you can use to determine the font sizes, the spacing, this cool purple gradient here, and so forth. So let's start out with that, pause the screencast, and work on building the header component. Well, first I'll get the pieces into place. I'm going to create a separate components folder, although this app is probably small enough that it's not really necessary. I'll just do it for practice sake. I'll create a header.js file inside of my components folder, and I'll just spin up a basic React component here. I'll do that little sanity check that I like to do just to see that it's working on the page. In my app.js, I will import my header. Let's put everything here in a div since I know that I'll have multiple things here. Okay, my header component is showing up. Next, let's get the content on the screen. I know it's not just an H1, so I think I'll surround this whole thing with a header element. And I probably wouldn't call this an H1 because it's not really the main headline of the page. It's sort of in the header itself. So let's maybe call it an H2. Before that, I'm going to have an image. And I already know the source is going to be my image's troll face. And let's see, it needs to be relative like this. That's probably going to be bigger than we want it to be, but we'll fix that in just a minute. And last of all, we have this React Course Project 3. I can't really decide what it should be. Let's just call it maybe an H4 or something. I know that I'm going to style my header, so I'll go ahead and give it a class name. We'll just say it's header. I'll hit save and go to my styles. Usually with two-dimensional layouts like this in a single line, I will revert to Flexbox. So we'll say this is display flex. We'll align everything to the center. From the design, it looks like the height is maybe about 65 pixels. That's making my image overflow a bit. We'll fix the image in just a minute, but I'm going to grab my background, which is from the design, so I'm just going to paste it directly from the design there. The color of the fonts and the text should be white. And there probably should be a bit of padding. I think we have something like 15 on the top and bottom and 20 on the left and right, although it might just be 20 all around. We'll just call it 20 all around. Then I will give some class names to the other elements here. We have header image, header title, and header project. So we'll start with the image. And we'll make sure that this fits within the boundaries of its parent by saying you have a max height of 100%. In the design, it looks like there's also some space, about 6 pixels, so I'll give this margin right of 6 pixels. The header title, it has a font size of about 20 pixels. And I can push my React Course Project 3 all the way to the right by giving my title a margin right of auto. We can see that a little more readily if I make this wider. Oh, and this still says header component. Let's update that to say meme generator. And let's lastly style our project text. That has a fairly small font size. We'll say that's about 12 pixels. And I think the weight is maybe different. Let's give it a font weight 500. And yeah, that does change it, so we'll leave that on there. And you know what? One thing I'm trying to get better at is using rems for my font size instead. 20 pixels over 16 pixels equates to about 1.25 rem. And 12 pixels over 16 is about 0.75 rem. Well, it's exactly 0.75 rem. Awesome work. This is a great start. The next thing we can do is attack this form here. We've got 2 inputs and a button. We're not quite ready to make them functional, but we can at least get them on the page. So let's do that in the next challenge. The next piece of our project that we can bite off is the form that we have right here with the 2 inputs and the button. So that's your challenge for this screencast. Don't worry at all about creating any functionality for it. I've outlined exactly the steps that I want you to do here. We're going to create a component called meme. Inside that meme component, we'll render a styled form, which will have our 2 inputs and our button. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Let's actually work backwards this time. I'm going to pretend that I already have a meme component created, so I'll just import it and render it, since I'm already here in this file, and then I'll actually create it. So inside of components, I'll create meme.js and set up my component. Now, I didn't talk about this specifically, but I happen to know ahead of time that I'm going to put both my form and the actual meme image and this text all into this same component. The reason I want to do that has to do with when we start talking about state and where state needs to live. So in an effort to reduce complexity, I'm just going to put everything in the one component. The reason I mention that is because I already know ahead of time that I'm going to use a main element to surround everything else on my app. If you didn't do that, it's completely okay, but this inside of here is where I'm going to put my form. I already know that my form has 2 inputs and a button. I've already got my button text copied and I'll paste it here since it's got the little emoji there. I also know that I want these to be a type of text, so I'll add the type text there. Let's hit save, see what we're working with. Okay, pretty generic styling. Let's give this some love in the CSS. I think the way that I would like to lay this out is using grid. I could probably use Flexbox as well, but what I'll do is make a 2-column and 2-row grid and lay the elements out there inside. The grid will be the form, so I'll make that the grid container. I'll give this a class name of form. And while I'm here, I think I'll give these their own class names as well. I'm going to put these on their own lines. We'll say these are form inputs, and I'll give my button a class name of form button. I guess I can also give my inputs some placeholder text, so we'll add top text and bottom text. It's a little more helpful. Now in our CSS, let's select our form. We'll change it to display grid, and then set up a grid template that has 2 40-pixel rows, and then evenly divide the columns with fraction units. So we'll have 2 columns, 1 FR each. Since I have 3 items, it's putting the first item filling up 1 column, the next item filling up the next column, and then the third item only filling up 1 column. The inputs look essentially the way that I want them to, but I want the button to span the whole thing. So I'll select my form button and tell it that its grid column will go from the very beginning to the very end. Awesome. It looks like in the design there's a little bit of a gap. I can use the gap property to spread things out a little bit. Then of course everything is butting up against the edges of my page here. I only am going to have one main element, so I'm just going to select the main element directly. And let's give it a padding, I think of about 36 pixels is what the design shows. One thing you might notice is that the placeholder text and the button text are not taking on our Carla font family. For whatever reason, inputs and buttons inside of forms tend not to do that. So I will specifically add that in my form button, and I will also select my form inputs. And I think I'll put this above my form button since my inputs are above my button in the markup. And I'll give that the font family as well. Let's also get some border radiuses here. I've got both of these as having a border radius of 5 pixels. My inputs have a border of 1 pixel solid, and then this color that I'm copying from the design. And oh, we need our hash mark there. There's a fun property called text indent that I learned about here. I can make it so that my placeholder text and my actual input text will bump in a little bit or have a little bit of an indent. We'll just give it a 5-pixel indent. And I just noticed that these styles are not applying. That's because I need this to say form input, not form inputs. Okay, that's working now. Let me comment this out. Yeah, you can see what the text indent is doing. Okay, my button needs a lot of help. I'm going to take the background from the design in the Figma file that also gives us that gradient of purple. I need to change the color to white. I'm going to remove the border. I always like my buttons to have a cursor of pointer. And awesome, that's looking great. It looks very much like our design. Now, at this point, I probably could separately create this image with the text sitting on top, but I think it's high time that we jump into actually understanding what it is we need to learn in order to do the functional parts of this application, including clicking the button and typing in our text. So in the next cast, we'll talk about what that will actually take. The primary thing that sets apart a static website like we've been building so far with web applications is the ability for the user to actually interact with our page. And in order for a user to interact with our page, we have to be listening for different events on that page and then reacting when those events happen. Let's get a quick overview as to how this app will work. As soon as the app loads for the very first time, it's immediately going to make a call to an API called ImageFlip, which will return to us an array of 100 meme images that are the most popular at that time. Then, clicking the Get a New Meme Image button will simply randomly choose one of those 100 images in the array that got returned to us. And as you've probably figured out, typing into the left input box will give us our top text, and typing into the right input box will give us our bottom text. Now, there's a lot in there that we need to break down before it becomes overwhelming. So let's start off really easy. The first thing we'll do is learn how to add an event listener to our button so that we can run some kind of logic when the button is clicked. And we'll start that in the next lesson. The primary thing that separates a static website from a web application is the ability for the user to interact with what they see on the screen. By now, you should have built plenty of JavaScript applications that used events and event listeners to allow the user to interact with your application. So this topic shouldn't really be new to you. You should already be familiar probably with two different ways that in a vanilla JavaScript application you can add events to your program. First of all, there's the .add event listener, which you probably are already familiar with. If you were adding a click event, you would then provide a function, and inside this function, you put the code of whatever should happen when the element that you're listening for an event on gets clicked. Alternatively, there's a way in HTML where you would essentially put on click and set that equal to the name of a function followed by parentheses. This second way is going to be much more similar to how we actually accomplish adding event listeners to items in React. For example, let's start with our button here. We're going to make it so that when we click the button, something will log to the console. In React, all I need to do is on my button, add an onClick. And you'll notice that I used a capital C. And that's because we are accessing the DOM properties of the object that's being created here. As a reminder, what React is doing is it's taking this JSX element that it sees, which in the end returns a plain JavaScript object describing the DOM element that should be created by React. And whatever properties or attributes we add here inside the JSX are directly accessing the equivalent properties in JavaScript. If I were to select this button in JavaScript using document.getElementById or something like that, I would have a DOM element that has a property called onClick with a capital C. And this camel casing is the standard throughout all of our JavaScript elements. So all that means is that instead of using the lowercase c like you might be used to doing in HTML, we're going to have camel cased properties everywhere. So onClick, maybe on mouse over, or on mouse enter, and so forth. Let me put this back to onClick and we'll see the other difference here. Now, instead of setting this equal to a string, which has a function name, because I'm here in JavaScript, I can actually just use a set of curly braces and then put a function directly here inside of my onClick. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of stuffing my functions inside of my markup here if I can avoid it. So what I usually do is above my return, but still inside my component, I'll define another function up here and say handle click maybe, because this is the click event handler. Then I can say console log I was clicked. Let me get rid of this, and I'm going to give you a mini challenge. Okay, pause the screencast and make it so that clicking the button will run our handle click function. A few of you may have been tricked into thinking that you can put handle click with a set of parentheses. And well, let me refresh and see what happens. Notice that as soon as I ran this code, it ran my handle click function. I don't want this set of parentheses here because that will run this function as soon as the program reads this line of code. Instead, I'm passing the function as a value so that React can add that function as the event handler in case a click ever happens on this button. So without the parentheses there, I can hit refresh, I'll clean this up, I can hit click me, and then that's when our click event handler runs. The React documentation has a full list of all of the events that it supports. I've included here a screenshot that you can click from the React documentation. This will take you specifically to the mouse events. I've personally found that mouse events probably make up a good 95% of the events that I listen for in any program I write. And you'll probably need to use this as a guide for the challenge that we will do right now. Your challenge is to log something to the console whenever the mouse hovers over the image. I added some CSS to darken the image just so it was a little more obvious when the mouse was actually hovering over the image. Again, feel free to use this as your reference. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. There's a couple different events that should work just fine for this challenge. We have onMouseEnter, which will run anytime the mouse enters an item that we're listening for an event on. And there's also onMouseOver, which essentially does the same thing. It just has a slight difference dealing with children elements. Right now, we don't have any children elements of our image, so it really wouldn't matter which one we use. First, let me create a function that will run when we are hovering over the image. Maybe I'll say handle onMouseOver. And we'll console log mouse over. And then I can simply add to my image, let's put it after the source, we'll say on mouse over equals, and then curly braces, because I'm going to put the name of our handle mouse over function. Pull these onto separate lines to make sure that we can see them well. Hit save. And now when I hover over the image, or rather when there's a mouse over event on the image, it runs our JavaScript code and we get that console log displaying down there. Feel free to poke around the documentation. Event listeners can be kind of fun, especially when there's a bunch that you may not have heard of. Just seeing how they work can be a fun thing to play with. Understanding this is going to be assumed from here on because you already should be a little bit familiar with events and event listeners at this point. Fortunately, doing it in React is actually fairly straightforward. And now this sets us up for one of the coolest parts of React, and we're going to jump into that next. Let's apply what we just learned about event listeners to our meme generator project. Ultimately, what we'll be doing is making an API call as soon as our component loads and getting data from an API that includes 100 of the most popular meme images right now, but we haven't quite yet learned everything we need in order to make that work. So for now, what I've done is I made the API requests and I just saved the data that came back here in memesdata.js. You can see we have the object, it's got a data property that has a memes property, and that is an array of 100 items. Each one of those items is an object that has a URL property. So you're going to have to do a little bit of digging into this memes data object, but your challenge is to make it so that when we click the button, it will randomly choose one of those URLs and just log it to the console. For now, don't worry about displaying the image yet. One modification I made to our markup here is I changed our form element into a div element. Long story short, when you have a button inside of a form, it actually submits that form and tends to refresh the page unless you stop it. But I realized that there's actually no reason for this to be collected together in a form because ultimately this button does its own thing by getting a new image. It does not take these inputs and submit them somewhere. So in this case, I feel like it's okay to have our inputs floating outside of a form, and that way it means that when we click our button, it doesn't refresh our page because it's not trying to submit a form. Okay, so the challenge is to get a random image from the memes data array, which I've already imported for you. You'll get that anytime this new meme image button is clicked. For now, just log the URL of that new image to the console. If you're feeling hazy on how to get a random item from an array, you'll probably want to turn to Google, but I know that you'll be able to do it. Pause the screencast, work on this challenge. Let's start by hooking up our button. I'm going to add an onClick event listener. And when the button is clicked, I will run a function that says getMemeImage. I haven't yet created that, so let's create that function, getMemeImage. For now, I'll just have it console log clicked to make sure that everything is hooked up correctly. I'll hit save, click the button, clicked. Okay, good. Now if we look closely at memes data, it's an object. There's the object. It has a data property which has a memes property. So I need memesdata.data.memes, and that's my array. I think I'll simplify that by simply saying const memes array equals memesdata.data.memes. And then I will generate a random number. So I'll say random number, and I can use math.floor, math.random times the length of my array. So that's memes array.length. This random number should get me a random index of my memes array. and that indexed item will be an object with a URL property. So let's actually just console log random number and see how we're doing so far. 16, 50, 92. Okay, I wanted to see a high number to make sure that it was going up to 100. I probably don't need to click this until I see 100, or actually I think it would be 99. So I can get my image object, or actually I can just do it all in one. I'll say const URL equals, and then I'll index into memes array at the index of random number. This is my object with a URL property. So I'll just save that as URL so it's nice and short. Or if we wanted to do some object destructuring, I could just say, get me the URL property from this memes array. I don't want to conflate a few things here, so I'll just keep it straightforward like this. And then we'll just console log the URL. Of course, I could do probably most of this in a single line, but I find that sometimes separating it out makes it a lot easier for other people to read. We'll hit save, and I guess I have no way to ensure that these are in the correct index, but I can't see why they wouldn't be. So this is awesome. We're getting random images every time we click our button. At this point, we are a little bit blocked, and I'll show you why. If I create, let's say, a paragraph down here, and I try to stick my URL in there, well, first of all, I have a problem because my URL is only declared inside of this function. And so this is not going to know what I'm talking about. If I hit refresh, it's going to say it doesn't know what URL is, essentially. So you might think, well, let's declare URL outside of the function. You could say let URL, and then just set URL equal to this and console log URL. Let me hit save, and now at least URL is, well, of course, my styling is all messed up because my paragraph is, let's put this outside here so we have that above. Click new meme image. Okay, well, we set URL equal to the new meme image right here. However, my UI did not update. This has everything to do with the way that React looks at variables and decides when it should update the UI or the user interface. And spoiler alert, it doesn't do that by just looking at every variable that we declare inside of our component. In the next cast, we're going to dive a little deeper into this conundrum that we have and start figuring out how we can make it so that we can update a variable that will then replace what we have on the screen with the new value of that variable. At this point in our journey, we have mostly been dealing with static websites. In the previous section, we showed how we can take data that we pull from, for example, an API. We were just using a little JavaScript local data file to mimic pulling from an API, and then we mapped over that array of data to display items on the screen. However, in order to interact with those items on the screen, we are still missing something. I want to demonstrate what I mean, but before we do that, just in case it's been a little while, let's get our hands in the keyboard with a quick challenge. I have here just a locally defined array with two strings in it, thing1 and thing2. I want you to map over the things array, generate a paragraph element for every item in the array, and then render those items below the button right here. This challenge harkens back to the last section where we learned about .map and how to take an array of data and turn it into elements on the page. So pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, what I'll do is create a new variable called maybe things elements, and I will set that equal to the array that comes back when I run .map on my original things array. We'll look at each thing in this array, which is just a string, and we'll return a JSX wrapped version of that string, so really just a paragraph element in JSX, where what we insert on the inside is the text of that thing. Thing is just a string, so it's fine if I just put it inside of my paragraph like that. Then things elements is an array of paragraph elements, and I can just put that inside my curly braces here, hit refresh, and now I have thing1 and thing2. I did get that warning about key, so I should probably just add a key prop here, and every one of these strings will be unique. We'll see why in just a second. So I'm just going to say that thing is the key, and that should set them apart and get rid of my warning there. Cool. Well, this is great, but we've got this button that doesn't currently do anything. Let me set up another quick challenge for you. The concept is going to be that you click the Add Item button, and it adds another thing to our things array. namely thing 3, and then you click it again, it'll be thing 4, and so forth. I'll type up this challenge now. Okay, your challenge is to add an event listener to our button so that when it gets clicked, it adds another thing to our things array. In your event listener, you can use thingsArray.length plus 1 to determine what number should get added to the next item in this array. And it also will be a good idea to make sure that at the very end of that event listener that runs when you click the button, that you console log your things array. And the reason is because, spoiler, the page is not going to update when you add new things to the array. I decided it would be important to let you know this little fact ahead of time so that you weren't pulling your hair out trying to figure out why the heck things weren't changing on the page. So pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, let's create a function called, we could call it handle click, or I could say add item maybe. And add item is going to, well, first let's just console log things array and set up our onClick add item so that we can see that it's working. Okay, so it's logging thing 1 and thing 2, the static array that we have there. So I probably could add the whole thing in one step just using thingsArray.push. I'm going to determine what the text of the new thing is first. So let's say new thing text, and that's going to be, I'm going to use a template literal so I can say thing space and then insert some JavaScript where I say things array.length plus 1. And then I can say thingsArray.push new thing text. And then of course I'm going to log the things array after I push the new item. Let me open the console so we can see that a little more clearly. I'll hit save. Add item. Okay. Oh, not a number, of course, because I spelled length wrong. Let's try that again. Add item, thing 3, thing 4, thing 5. Great. Well, our array is changing, but of course what we see on the screen is not. And this brings us to our conundrum. At this point, React is not looking at local arrays that are just saved within a component to determine whether or not something should get re-rendered. Or rather, if the return here should run again with an updated value for things elements. Actually, maybe more specifically, I'm determining my things elements way up here at the top, back when things array is just 2 items long, and then it's sort of cementing this things elements into its memory, and no matter what I do to change things array, it's not going to automatically change things elements. In my early days, I thought maybe if I put this below add item or something like that, it might make a difference, but that's not going to change the fact that this line of code will only run one time, and that's the very first time the app component gets rendered right here. Let me clean this up real quick. Now, one thing that might be tempting to do is inside of our add item function to say, well, let's not just update our array, let's actually select the elements on the screen using document.getElement by ID and finding out where the container for these items is, and then pushing a new paragraph element to that list. And the truth is, when you're just using plain JavaScript, that's essentially what you have to do. But if you think back to one of our earlier sections, we talked about how React is declarative. And this is one of the major benefits of having a declarative library like React. It makes it so that all we really need to do is update our data, and React will automatically, react to that change and update our UI to display what has changed in the data. All we need to be in charge of is making sure that the data updates correctly, and React will handle the rest. However, for that to work, we need to access something called React State. And state will allow us to sort of hook into the component and make it so that whenever we update our state, which is really just values that we're saving inside of this component, it makes it so React will update the user interface based on any changes that happen to those values that are being saved in state. And truthfully, if you think of pretty much any website that you interact with, if it were made in React, any kind of interaction you had would change the state. The first thing that comes to mind is maybe, I don't know, a playlist or a recipe where you hit the little heart icon or maybe a bookmark icon, and it fills it in and likely sends a message out to a database that updates the fact that you have liked a recipe or a song. Or maybe it's an accordion or a carousel where you click something and an image shifts over or a portion of the page expands so you can read more information. Any of those interactions in React are going to be updating state, which then makes it so that React can update the user interface to respond to however you interacted with the page. So now let me update this using state, and you can see how it will actually start to work again the way we originally expected. Obviously, at this point, some of this will look a little bit foreign, and that's totally okay. We're going to dive deep into understanding how to actually write this ourselves, but you can see that not that much changed in my actual code, but suddenly I have an app that's working the way that I expected. The example is a little bit contrived, obviously, but hopefully you can see the exciting world of state in React that we're approaching and start to imagine some of the cool things that it's going to allow us to do. So buckle up and get ready to jump into React State. One thing I've learned over my years of teaching React is that one of the major points of confusion for students when they're first learning React is understanding the difference between props, which you have already learned, and state, which we are about to learn. So let's take some time and clarify the differences between the two and when you would want to use one over the other. And the first thing we'll do is look at props. We've seen how we can implement props in practice, but let's take a second to actually talk about them. When we refer to props, we are referring to the properties that we are passing into a component in order for that component to work correctly. This is similar to how a function can receive parameters, quote unquote, from above. Just like a function that receives parameters, a component that receives props is not allowed to modify those props, or in other words, those props are called immutable. Let's first take a look at a regular function. Let's say I define a function that says add two numbers, and I pass in my parameters of a and b. As I'm writing the logic of this function, I'm going to assume that this function will be passed a and b. Of course, I could always do some kind of check that says if there's no such thing as a, or if a is equal to undefined, then throw some kind of error that says you need to provide both a and b. But other than that, inside of the body of the function, I can just assume that I have a variable a, which is a parameter that has been passed to this function, and I can assume that I have a parameter b, another parameter passed to this function. And that's what I mean by being passed from above. When we actually use this function, we'll say add two numbers. I'll provide my actual values that I want to represent the parameters a and b, and my function can then do its job. The main point that I want to come across here, however, is that inside the body of this function, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for me to modify or mutate these parameters. For example, I wouldn't want to say, forget what you just gave me for a, I'm going to set it equal to 42. Naturally, this should feel wrong to you because essentially we're ignoring anything that is passed in as the first parameter here and just setting it equal to 42. Technically, this probably works. If I were to console log the result from add two numbers, 1 and 2, of course I would expect it to be 3, but we'll see that it's actually 44, and that's because we've overwritten a to be something different. Similarly, in React, I would never want to have a component, let's say a navbar, that takes props, but then automatically sets props dot, I don't know, let's say cover image equal to something else. This is a huge red flag. You would never want to set props.anything or props itself equal to anything different because incoming props should be immutable and they should never change manually. Or maybe more specifically, those props should never change from within the body of our component itself. Now, that's not to say that when I have an instance of my navbar that I can't provide a cover image that changes. Let's say it starts out as some image 1, and then, I don't know, maybe there's a button on the screen. When the user clicks that button, I want my navbar's cover image to update to some other image. Maybe this is a little convoluted because I'm not really using images here. But the point is, I can change the values that I pass to my component. That's fine. That's something I'm allowed to do, and as we jump into state, we're going to see why that's even useful. But from within the body of the function, I should never ever change my props, in the same way that I would never want to change the parameters being passed to my function. Another way to think about props, here we read that they are the properties being passed into a component in order for it to work correctly. If it helps, you could think of it as the properties being passed to a component in order to configure it. As we saw in our last section project, we passed props to our card component in order for that card to be reusable and configure it to display the correct image, the correct price, the correct stats like the review count and so forth. And oftentimes you'll find components that do more than just take in the data that should just be displayed as a part of the component. Sometimes they will receive configuration objects or properties. Let's say, for example, off the top of my head, if we had a component that we wanted to display either in light mode or dark mode, well, then maybe I would have a dark mode property that I could set to true. In this case, I'm not necessarily displaying the literal text true for dark mode or the text dark mode is activated or anything like that, but instead this is a property that is configuring my navbar in order for it to act and display correctly. Okay, I might be beating a dead horse here, so let's move on, and we're going to see how the use of state will differ from our usage of props. If props are data that a component is receiving from above and shouldn't be changing, state, on the other hand, are values that are defined within a component and essentially should be changing. So as we see here, state refers to any values that are managed by the component itself, kind of like a function that declares its own variables from within that function. Long story short, anytime your component has changing values that should be saved and displayed, you're most likely going to be using state. We'll jump into what this looks like in React in a second, but I think it might be helpful to see how this compares in a vanilla JavaScript example, kind of like we did with our add two numbers and having what we can equate to props being passed in as these parameters, and how we shouldn't be changing them from within the definition of this function itself. In order to create an equivalent in vanilla JavaScript of our concept of state, let me write out a challenge for you. Let's say we have a function called greeting. It takes a name as a parameter, and what it should return is a string like good afternoon and then followed by the name. Of course, afternoon will change depending on the current time of day, as you can read from the challenge description up there. At this point, this is more of a vanilla JavaScript algorithm challenge for you, but I think it's good to incorporate those into our React course here. And maybe just so that I'm not making you chase Google a whole bunch right now, I'm going to give you a couple hints here. So you can get the current time of day by following these two lines of code. Essentially, first you create a new date object in JavaScript, and then you use that date to get the current number of hours. These hours are zero index, so 12 a.m. is 0, 11 p.m. is 23. And just to be clear, I have included the 11:59, 4:59, and everything up here just to be clear what hours should be included in morning. This one's kind of funny because I don't know that I would ever say goodnight to someone at 3:59 a.m., but whatever. My point is you won't need to get the minutes here. You can just use the hours like I've shown you here. Pause the screencast, see if you can complete this challenge, and then we're going to bring the concepts back into understanding state in React. Now, I won't spend a bunch of time talking about the logic of this. We'll just put in a solution here and then talk about how this equates to state in React. I have the number of hours now. If I console log those hours, it's 12 p.m. my time, so my answer should say 12 there. Yep. So I will type out some logic that I think will just kind of intuitively make sense. The first thing I'll do is just declare a changeable value here, time of day, and then depending on the current number of hours, I will change the string time of day to be either morning, afternoon, evening, or night, just like I talked about in the challenge. And now that I have a time of day value, I can simply return the string, and I'll use some interpolation here. We'll say good, and then we'll stick in the time of day, comma, and then I'll use the value for name that I'm receiving as the parameter to greeting, exclamation point, and let's go ahead and see if this works. Again, it's about 12 o'clock my time, so I should, when I'll need to console log this, the value that gets returned. Good afternoon, Bob. Okay. Now, the point here is my function is receiving a parameter. This parameter is not something that I will want to change in the way of saying name equals something different, because that would just be a kind of a strange thing to do when you are expecting the outside user of this function to provide you the name. Similarly, in React, we are not going to take any props and then just change them, which is what we talked about in the last screencast. However, there are definitely reasons for us to, within our own function, create values that we can either use or even change, like our let time of day here. In React, values that are created by the function or the component itself are usually handled with state. Okay, I think that's more than enough of the conceptual difference between props and state. At this point, it's probably best for us to just get our hands dirty and start actually seeing how we can implement state in React. And then as we build our section project, we will get much better exposure into how state and props will work together and how they are different from each other as well. It's time for another quiz. This one's going to specifically be looking at the difference between props and state. So, as always, read through these questions, click into the editor, type down your answers, and when you're satisfied with your answers, click play and we'll go through the quiz together. On a higher level, the concept of state is sort of like saying the way things currently are. Here in the United States, the president gives a yearly address called the State of the Union. Growing up, that always confused me because the United States is made up of 50 states, and I thought it had something to do with that. But no, it means the way that things currently are. In React, state refers to values that a component can maintain between render cycles. This will make more sense when we get into the syntax of it, but let me type down a more concise answer to this question. The concept of state is essentially a way for React to remember some saved values from inside of a component. This is similar to declaring variables within a component, but there are a few added bonuses to it, which we're going to get to later. So when would you use props instead of state in React? I think the easiest way to think about this is to compare it to regular JavaScript functions. Props are like passing parameters into a function that the function then uses to help it determine the output, what gets returned. So in React, you would want to use props anytime you need to pass data into a component so that that component can use that data to determine what should get displayed on the screen. In some cases, the data that we pass in will directly be data that is displayed, like in the instance of text. But sometimes it will be data that's really just meant to, so to speak, configure the component so that the component can use it to determine how something gets displayed. Okay, so when would you want to use state instead of props? Continuing with our function analogy, state is kind of like when inside of the body of a function you declare new variables, and you use those new variables to help you accomplish some task inside of the function. In React, you would use state anytime you needed a component to maintain its own values. As we mentioned earlier, it's slightly different than just declaring a regular variable. We're going to see the syntax of it later and how it differs, but for now that should be a sufficient answer to this question. So you would use state anytime you want a component to maintain some values from within that component, and by the way, also remember those values even when React needs to re-render the component. Again, we're going to see that much more in detail a little bit later. And a little bit out of left field, what does the term immutable mean? And then are props immutable and is state immutable? Immutable technically means unchanging. The reason I bring this up is because we learned that props are immutable. We should not ever change props from within the component that's receiving props. Doing so essentially defeats the entire purpose of props. Think of it like a function that receives a parameter but then just decides to change the value of those parameters to something different. It pretty much invalidates the whole purpose of passing parameters into a function. So props are immutable. In this case, I don't think props are literally immutable. You can try to set them equal to something else, and I don't believe it will crash your program, although it may throw a warning. But maybe a better way to describe it is saying that you should not change props, and therefore they are immutable. State, on the other hand, is not immutable, or in other words, state is mutable. The purpose of declaring state in a component is because you do plan on changing state. Okay, we're done with the quiz. Nice work. When you're ready, let's keep moving forward. We saw in an earlier lesson how it's not going to work for us, at least in React, to just declare regular variables like, let's say, state is equal to yes, and expect React to re-render our component if for some reason that state ever changed. If you recall, we had an array of items and we had a button that allowed us to push new elements to that array, but whenever we did that, it didn't actually update our page. And that's because React doesn't watch for local variable changes. So the first thing we'll do is learn how to actually declare state inside of our component, and in the next cast we'll talk more about how to actually change that state. As a part of the React library, there is a method called useState. And useState is one of many what are called hooks in React. There's a little bit of history as to why it's called hooks. We're probably just not going to worry too much about it right now. But the point is I can declare some state by simply calling react.useState. Now, another way you might oftentimes see this is people will destructure it directly in the import statement. They'll grab the useState method from React as well, and then they can just use useState. In fact, I would suppose this is the more common way you will usually see it happen. However, just for perfect clarity and for it to be very clear that useState is part of the React library, I'm actually going to use react.useState because I do find that it makes it a lot more clear where this useState method is coming from. Let's go ahead and see what comes back. We'll say const result equals react.useState, and then we'll console log result, just to see what actually comes back by calling react.useState. I'll open the console, hit save, and look at that. Okay, so that's interesting. We get an array back, and the array has its first value as undefined, and its second value, well, in Scrimba it says f parentheses. That just means that it's a function. Now, let's see what happens when I put something inside the parentheses. Let's say the string hello. I'll hit save, and now the first value of my array is the string hello. So whatever I put inside of my parentheses when I'm calling useState is going to be the default value for the state variable that I want to save. Okay, so now that leads me to a little mini challenge that will require you to think a little bit critically. I'm going to type the challenge out now. Okay, your job is to replace this yes with a string yes that isn't just hard-coded inside, but rather is created by using react.useState. Remember, what we get back by calling react.useState is not just the string hello, it's actually an array. So let that guide you as you work this challenge. Pause the screencast and work on this now. The first thing I can do is change hello to yes, and then my result is an array, and the index of 0 should be, let me just log this, should be my string yes. So I could replace this yes with a set of curly braces because I need to jump into JavaScript, and then I can say result at the index of 0. I'll hit save, and we get yes the exact same way we had it before. But now if I were to change this to no, which is not true, state is important to know, awesome, our page actually updates with the state that we had created with react.useState. Change this back to yes because it certainly is important to know. Okay, well there's a couple of problems we have. First of all, this is kind of clunky to say result at the index of 0. In the next screencast, we're going to learn a little bit more about what we can do with this array, and then we will bring out the real power of using state by allowing the user to interact with our page and change state themselves. So when you're ready, let's jump into those topics. As we saw, what we get back by calling react.useState is an array where the first item is the value of the state that we are hoping to save, kind of like initializing a variable inside of our component. And the second item of that array is a function. So we saw how we could use result at the index of 0 to get our value. However, there's actually a much smoother way to deal with this. And this requires us to use array destructuring. Since react.useState returns an array, what we can do is actually destructure that array immediately upon receiving it as a variable, and then we can provide two values, and let me just put func because we know the second value is a function. Now in this case, if I rerun console log result, what we see is that we have pulled out the first item in the resulting array of react.useState and destructured it into its own variable called result. What's nice about using array destructuring is that we get to call this whatever we want. If this were object destructuring, we would have to use the property name of the object that comes back by calling react.useState. But because they return an array, we can call it whatever we want. So if I console log whatever we want, we get the same thing, yes. Oh, and now my result down here is broken, so if I change that to whatever we want, we get back to the way we were. Now, don't use silly names like whatever we want. Instead, let's say maybe is important. We'll choose a variable name that makes a lot of sense for what the value is that we're trying to keep track of. And that's the concept of using array destructuring in order to more smoothly get values from React.useState. In the next screencast, let's talk more about this function here. Let's take a look now at the function that we receive here when we destructure the array that comes back from React.useState. Normally, if we had a variable where we were saving this, if we just said something like let is important equal yes, then we already know we could simply say is important equals something different, like no. However, when we're working with state, we can't simply say is important equals something different. Instead, we are given a function that allows us to make these changes so that React can handle those changes accordingly. Let me delete these lines here, and let's take a look at this function. Now, normally we wouldn't just call this func, so let's give this a more meaningful name. The convention that you'll oftentimes see is set, and then the rest of the variable that we called our state. So set is important. In this case, I need a capital I to make my camel casing correct. And this set is important is a function that I can run, and whatever value I provide to it is going to be the new version of state. Now, of course, running this function immediately after generating state is kind of silly. In fact, I'm not even certain that it would work. Instead, we would normally want to set or change the state whenever something specific happens on the page. So let me type up a challenge so we can do something like that. Okay, just to avoid confusion, I created the actual function body for you, but your challenge is to have this function run this line of code, and then to set up an event listener on this div so that it runs handle click whenever anywhere inside this circle gets clicked. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, simply enough, I can copy this line of code, put it in there, and then I need to set up an event listener here. So I'll say on click, again, capital C. We will run our handle click function. Hit refresh. And when I click my button here, awesome. Okay, notice that as soon as I clicked, it changed from yes to no. What happened is we took the function that we were given when we called React.useState. This function's job is to give us the ability to change state if we wanted to. And we used it in the most simple way possible, which is to simply provide a new version of state. As soon as this line gets called, which of course happens as soon as we click our div here, then set is important gets called, and the state changes to no. And well, at this point we've kind of hit a dead end, because obviously this is incorrect. State is very important to know, but notice that if I click this again and again, well, nothing is changing, and that's because every time I click it, it immediately sets it to no. In the next screencast, let's work on a challenge that will help get your hands on the keyboard practicing using state. All right, here we have something that's a little more dynamic. The idea is we will create a little counter. When I hit plus, this number should go up. When I hit minus, this number should go down. To start us off and to get your hands on the keyboard, I'm going to have you complete this challenge where you're going to set up state to track our current count. And our initial value is going to be 0. Pause the screencast and see if you can complete this challenge. To create new state, we simply use react.useState. And we can provide the initial value of 0, and then we need to essentially catch what this returns in some variables. It's an array, and because what we get is an array and I can destructure it, that means I can call it whatever I want. In the first index, I receive the value, which I'll call the count. And by convention, I will call my setter function setCount. This is the function that when I call it will allow me to update the state here. One last thing that I didn't specifically say to do and wouldn't be very obvious unless I did, is to use this count value to replace our 0 here. Now, at this point, nothing is going to look like it has changed. I still don't have the ability to raise or lower this number. Now let me build up to the next section by updating our challenge. Okay, your challenge is to create a function that's called add that runs whenever the plus button is clicked. This is just practice on event listeners in general. For now, you can just have it console log the string add or something along those lines. A good rule of thumb to use is to declare these functions inside of your component. So instead of going up here outside of your component and creating your function called add, it's better to declare that function right here inside of your component. Pause the screencast and work on this part of the challenge. Okay, let's declare a new function called add. And for now, we'll just console log add. And let's see, here is my plus button. So I will add an on click of add. And now I should click this button and get my console logging add. Awesome. Okay, at this point, we're running into an issue, and that is how we can update our count. What we most recently saw is that I could say set count and then provide some kind of immediate hard-coded value here. However, that doesn't really help us because even if I provide a 1, if I run this code, it will work. Notice that when I click the add button, it sets the count to 1. Therefore, it re-renders our app and changes the 0 to 1. However, of course, if I hit plus again and again and again, it's just constantly setting it to 1, and it doesn't really accomplish what we want. So I want you to think critically. I'm going to update our challenge. I want you to see if you can think of a way so that clicking the plus button will increase our number by 1 every time and display it correctly on the screen. Obviously, hard-coding a 1 here is not going to work. Pause the screencast and see if you can figure out this challenge. Hopefully you were able to figure out that we do have access to our current count. And so I can just say I want you to set the count equal to whatever the current count is plus 1. Let me hit save. We'll see that this is working. Okay, that's awesome. But I wanted to use this as a chance to show you a common misconception or fallacy that beginners in React tend to fall into. And that is trying to do something like count plus plus, or even plus plus count if you're familiar with the differences between those two. Let's look at count plus plus, for example. In the philosophy of React, something like count plus plus is strictly forbidden. And that's because we never want to modify state directly. What I mean by that is this. Count plus plus is a shorthand for count equals count plus 1. And in this case, using count equals is just a big no-no. You will never ever do that when you're modifying state. The entire reason that we have this set count function is so that we can simply provide a new updated value, but we will never ever want to run an equal sign after our state value. So let me put this back to count plus 1. We'll see that this is working. And now I want to update our challenge to finish off the basic portion of this app. Okay, your task is to add functionality to the minus button now. Of course, clicking the minus button should decrease our number by 1. Pause the lesson and see if you can figure this one out. All we need to do is to create a subtract function instead. So I'll create a new function called subtract. Of course, this one should take count and subtract 1. And then we need to add our onClick handler for the minus button. So that will go right here. Subtract. And once I hit save, we should be able to go backwards as well. Awesome, great work. However, I do have a little bit of bad news. Although we were able to use our count state value here in order to help us determine the new count, it turns out we're not actually following best practices when it comes to using this state value here. So in the next screencast, we're going to see another way that we can use the setCountSetter function to update our state value. Although currently it's technically working for us to use our current state value in order to determine the new state value when we're setting our count, it turns out there's actually a better way to use setCount in this case whenever we need to use our old version of state to determine our new version of state. We've seen how we can simply provide a new value to our setter function. However, there's another way that we can use this setter function, and that is to provide a callback function inside. When we provide a callback function as the parameter to our setter function, this function needs to return the new value that we want state to be. If we essentially wanted to recreate what we did by passing a simple value to our setCount function, we could just have our callback function here return count plus 1. However, this is where the best practices comes in. Anytime we need to use our old state value to determine a new state value, if we provide this function, React will pass this function the old value as the parameter here. What we can do is then take this old value and use that as our reference to what count was at the time that this function was called. This might be really confusing at this point. It would require us to jump a little bit deeper into how React handles state changes and re-renders to truly understand why this is best practice. For now, I think it's going to be enough to simply say if you ever need to use the old value of state in order to determine the new value of state, you should just always plan to pass a function to setCount. This might be a little disheartening because this already looks way more complicated than what we had here. Fortunately, if we use arrow functions, we can simplify this quite a bit. I can just say, given the old value, return old value plus 1. Usually what I'll do is use the prefix of prev and then use my state value. So I'll say prev count as in previous count. So this is the convention you'll usually see me using whenever I'm using a callback function as my parameter to setCount. Because that was a little bit confusing, I'm going to type this out as a note so that maybe those of you who are more visual learners will be able to comprehend it a little better. So again, if you ever need the old value of state to help you determine the new value of state, or in other words, if the new value of state depends on knowing what the old value of state was, you should always pass a callback function to your state setter function instead of using the state directly like we're doing down here. Then this callback function will receive a previous version or the old version of the state value, which you can then use to determine the new state value. With that said, let's do a quick challenge. Okay, your challenge is to update our subtract function to use this callback function as the state setter instead of what we currently have. Pause the screencast and update our subtract function. Fortunately, with arrow functions, this is still very concise. I can say prev count, arrow, prev count minus 1. And just for demonstration, when I refresh this, you can see everything is working exactly the way as it was. You're obviously more than welcome, if you're really curious, to deep dive into this, do a bunch of Google and YouTube searches to truly understand why this is better. Frankly, I would say probably 90% of the time you would never notice a difference between what we used to have and what we currently have. However, it is generally accepted as best practice to do it this way. And all of this is not to say that there's no instance in which you would want to just provide a bare value for your setter. That certainly does happen still. But in the spirit of teaching you best practices in React, it's probably good enough just to understand what I'm talking about here in this note and to move on. A good practice at this time might be to delete everything that we're dealing with state here and to try and recreate it from scratch. Maybe as a way to test your own skills to see if you are truly comprehending what we've done so far. When you feel like you've got a good grasp on this, let's keep moving forward. Let's pause now and do another quick quiz. Like you've done before, pause the screencast, click into the editor here, actually type down your answers to the questions that you see here, and then we will go through the quiz together. Pause now and work on the quiz. Okay, number 1, you have 2 options for what you can pass into a state setter function like setCount. What are those options? Well, option A is to pass in simply the new value of state. So if you call setCount and you provide a new value like 42, whenever this function gets called, state will automatically be updated to the number 42. And option B is to pass a callback function, and then whatever the callback function returns, we'll say whatever the callback function returns will be the new value of state. And then numbers 2 and 3 both refer back to the answer to number 1. So when would you want to use the first option, in our case, the new value of state? This is any time you want to update your state and you do not care what the previous value of state was, or rather, you don't need the previous value of state to help you determine what the new value of state should be. And then the answer to number 3 is basically the opposite of number 2. It's whenever you do need the previous value of state to help you determine the new value of state. Under the hood, React is doing some relatively complex things to make sure that it can maintain state for you. One of those things has to do with batching a bunch of different state changes together. So if you were to run 2 state setter functions back to back, the way that React handles it may or may not run one of them before the other. That's a very high-level overview of why we need to do this, but when we pass a callback function to our state setter function, we can be guaranteed that the value that callback function receives, which in the previous lesson we were calling prev count, we can be guaranteed that it will receive the most updated correct version of that so that it can update state correctly. If that didn't make any sense, that's completely okay. That's really why I didn't want to dive too deep into it, because at this point, it truly is enough to know that if you need the old value of state to help you determine the new value of state, you should pass a callback function. Otherwise, you don't need to pass a callback function. Okay, I'm probably beating a dead horse at this point. When you're ready, let's keep moving forward. Now that we've learned how to create and update our state, let's revisit our meme generator. We figured out earlier how to get a random URL for a meme image. However, the conundrum we ran into was that we couldn't update our user interface with that image because React wasn't listening to our local variables. Now that we know about state, we should be able to add an image to our meme generator. So your challenge is to first create a new piece of state called meme image that will just start with an empty string as a default. And when the getMemeImage function is called, you'll save the random URL, which we still have access to right here, in the state for meme image. Once you've done that, you should be able to add an image element below our div here with the form that has its source set to the new meme image state that you created. As a bonus, you may want to add some styling so that the image stays confined within the space that we're working with here. Pause the screencast and work on adding an image to our meme generator. Right near the top here, I'm going to create meme image and set meme image, which will come back from react.useState. The initial value is an empty string. Down in my getMemeImage function, we can call setMemeImage. And now think for a second, do I need access to the old state, the old string here, in order to determine what my new string should be? And the answer is no. I don't care what it used to be. I'm completely replacing it with the new URL, which I can get through memesArray at the index of random number.url. And that should complete these first 2 tasks. Lastly, I'm going to use my new meme image to create an image element and give it the proper source. Meme image, let's hit save. And well, it says we have an error. Let's go ahead and just see what happens. I'll click get a new image, and look at that. We've got an image now. Obviously, it's pretty large. Let's see if we can just add maybe a class name. And for now, let's call it maybe meme-image. In my styles, I'll add meme image, and let's say it's got a max width of 100%. I'll hit refresh. Click get a new meme image, and look at that. Now, I don't know immediately what this error is coming from. I think for now I'm going to ignore it, and we'll see if we can figure it out later down the road. Awesome work. Now, this is just the beginning. We have a lot left to learn about state, but don't let that be daunting. It's going to be really fun. So when you're ready, let's keep pushing forward. At this point, it will be helpful for us to practice the ternary operator, whether you've learned it before or not. I've written some very basic JavaScript here. We just have a variable called isGoingOut that is set to the Boolean true, and then we are using that value to determine what the answer should be that we display in our H1 over on the page. Obviously, if isGoingOut is true, then we'll say yes, and otherwise we'll say no. If it's been a while since you've worked with the ternary or you never really fully grasped it, I've included a link here to the MDN docs on how to use the ternary operator. So once you feel prepared, pause the screencast and see if you can clean up our code using a ternary. A ternary allows us to put an if-else statement onto a single line. Technically, you can also manage if-else statements and get